जी, welcome to the PIDE webinar. Assalamu alaikum. Kya haal hai? Is everybody okay? Acha ji, let's begin. We're going to begin the fifth of our webinar series in education. Energy. Today is the day for energy. Please mute your mics. Let's start. This is the fifth in our series. Energy is a very big problem. We are trying to learn about it. We don't know enough about it. Unfortunately, the country doesn't know enough about it. So we've called our panel again. We've got a large number of very good people on energy. Let's try and take up the issue of regulation and pricing. I find this a most complex issue. I hope our speakers can educate me on this. This is not pricing bananas or wheat or something. It's a very difficult subject. And it's not regulating the market for, coal or energy, like all markets, it's a very complex phenomenon, but energy is even more complex for many reasons, and we'll come to that. But let's begin with our usual slide, the IMF dragging or putting no loans in front of the government, and the government in a confused fashion just running around looking at the craggy hills of conditions coming up. This is the story of Pakistan. We've got a great panel. We're going to see.
Sorry, sir, your slides are stuck, sir.
As usual, the slides are stuck. Okay, let's do this. Okay, Ji. So let's do it without the show. Huh? Someday I'll master it. Okay, Ji. So let's see if we can do it this way. Let's see. Ab dekin, Mansoor sir, will it move or not? Will it not move?
Sir, you are on second slide now.
Okay, let's see. Is it second slide? Okay.
Yes.
We've got the Deputy Director of NEPRA, Salman Rahman, who's going to be telling us about how their views are as well as their plans are for pricing and regulation. We've got Amina Sohail, energy lawyer, who's apparently worked on this a lot and still working on it, and she will tell us how it should be done. Then we've got Tahir Bisharat Chima, former MD Pepco, who's been helping us a lot. We've also got Shahid Sattar, who's also helping us a lot. He's also going to talk about this. And of course, we've got a large number of people in the panel who are going to talk about energy pricing and regulation. Okay. Our usual slide, the number of fund programs we've done. Every Pakistani must know this, that we've always been in the emergency ward, that somehow we can't seem to get our economic policy together. And I think this should worry us all. Why is it that we can't get our economic policy together after 70 years? 70 years ago, our forefathers recognized that we would have an aid problem. And they were so right, as this cartoon shows, that Liaquat Ali is walking on the crutches of aid, and people behind him are saying, hey, keep him drugged. And that's the way we still continue. Our long-term growth rate is declining thanks to aid and thanks to our bad policy. Investment is not picking up. Investment rate is declining, even though it's the lowest in Asia. It's about 15% and declining. So it doesn't look like we're doing very well, although you'll hear people saying current account has changed. Big deal if the current account has changed. Your investment rate has gone nowhere. Your growth rate is not growing, so current account people are watching. We've done a series of roundtables, and they show that on many subjects, and they show that policy inconsistency and poor policy development is a huge issue in Pakistan. Our tax policy is totally confused. Transactions costs are very high. We don't have human resource management either in the government or in the private sector. We've got a huge state mentality. Market development is not happening. Everywhere we've got over-regulation and lack of clarity. There's a huge governance problem everywhere, especially in the energy. Cities and markets are a governance problem. And information risk-taking is just not taking place in Pakistan.
Sorry, sir. You are on your second slide, sir. We are looking your second
slide. Okay. So let's go back. Okay, I showed you the man. Let me just make sure that you see this. The cartoon
from
19.
Yes, sir.
Okay, let's see. Make sure you saw the declining growth. Make sure you saw the investment rate, how we are declining. PAD roundtables, what's happening. Now, energy. So far, what we've learned is very simple. Circular debt, we paid up 5.5 trillion over the last 10 years. Piled up is 2 trillion, which you'll have to pay. There is still no clarity on the energy sector, no research. And a few days ago, we talked to one energy ministry, the petroleum ministry, and they said ADB is doing another study. Wow, yet again another study by the ADB and the World Bank. And we still don't know what's happening. So it speaks volumes for both them and us. There's no clarity of research. This is an organizational mess. All our speakers, all our panelists who are still here will tell us it's an organizational mess. It's far too centralized. There is no responsibility anywhere. There's no planning for supply. We move from oversupply to overdemand, excess demand, excess supply. We chuck around because nobody seemed to plan or think about the sector as a whole. Nowadays, we've again got into an excess supply situation. On demand, people spend electricity like water. They don't know what to do. And yet the price is very high. So there's a mess everywhere. So given that, let me come to the panel. Let me ask Afia from PAID to initiate the discussion. Afia?
Ji, sure.
Afia, quickly initiate the discussion. Ji.
Yeah. I just want to raise a few more questions. The first one is, why can't we have an efficient tariff structures without subsidies? Tariff structure in which costs are not recovered from all consumer categories indiscriminately, besides creating financial difficulties for the government, also create inefficiencies in the system and misleads investment decisions in the supply system. In Pakistan, why we are treating electricity as a right rather than as a private good? It leads to inefficient subsidies, theft, supply without payment, and losses for distribution companies. A weak link between price and demand over the years and substantial cross-subsidization has skewed consumption in favor of less productive domestic consumers. Over the years, we have failed in eliminating cross-subsidization from commercial and industry to domestic and agriculture consumers, whereas highest recovery ratios are recorded in these two sectors, and we are charging them a high price as well. Similarly, the policy of uniform tariffs, which is acting as an incentive to remain inefficient. In principle, the subsidy should assure the financial viability of the sector. But in Pakistan, we see discourse performance below the efficiency benchmark, which NAPRA uses to determine the cost-based tariffs. Losses are incurred despite having this subsidy. So why can't we revisit this policy of uniform tariffs, where in many countries, including India, there is a separate tariff in each state? Now, again, we are talking about market. NAPRA Act is, there is an amendment in NAPRA Act and a new regulatory regime has been introduced, but it seems due deliberations are not done. Requirement to maintain a uniform tariff throughout the country, as it is stated in the draft of new power policy, seems to be contradictory with this new NAPRA Act. Energy pricing is a central feature of any competitive electricity market. It is essential if the benefits of a competitive market are to flow through to customers and other market participants. And when pricing is inefficient, it will fail to signal and encourage appropriate levels of consumption and supply, or the appropriate levels and locations of new generation and transmission investment. For the market to function effectively, we need to treat electricity as a commodity, requiring minimal government intervention in the marketplace. And one more thing which needs clarity is NAPRA independent in their decisions? What is the role of a regulator in power purchase agreements in Pakistan? As they are the main licensing authority, as we see, all the decisions and activities are in the government's influence and without due competitive procedures. Now we are in a capacity trap. We have surplus power and we are in a capacity trap. Don't you think that there is a need to explore an alternate pricing mechanism to utilize this surplus power and increase the productive use of energy? Cost and tariff can be brought down by increasing capacity utilization. More incentive should be given to large consumers, for instance, by decreasing the tariffs for units consumed beyond a certain threshold for large consumers or industry who are also paying regularly. This will encourage such consumers to increase their consumption, and the country will be able to utilize the present surplus. I just want to ask what NEPRA is doing in this context and how they are planning to utilize this surplus power. Is there any plan to have an alternate pricing mechanism, or they are going to continue with the same pricing mechanism? Similarly, is there I think that's enough.
Okay,
With this, over
thank
to you,
you.
Dr. Nadeem. Yeah.
Thank you, Afia. Salman Rahman, can you please tell us what the regulatory regime in NEPRA is? What should it be? Is it the same as the world? Why do we have so many pricing slabs and situations? I don't think I have seen 3 types of tariffs and pricing slabs anywhere else in the world, maybe in some banana republics. Salman Sahab, can you shed some light on how, I don't care about the past, are we going to move into the future in the regulatory setup? Are we going to regulate and price better, or is it always going to be like this? Salman Sahab.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for inviting us. The participant have actually put a number of questions at NEPRA. Definitely one of the main subject was associated, actually is associated with NEPRA. So I mean, I've noted a couple of questions that have been raised, and I'll try to answer them one by one as much as I could to the best of my ability. But if I'm missing anything, you can always revert back and I'll answer that. So, I mean, Dr. Saab actually talked about the uniformity of tariff and also why there are so many slabs within the category. One issue which we need to be aware of is that the slab categorization is primarily driven by the socio-economic objective of the government. For instance, there is a lifeline consumer wherein the government do not necessarily, I mean, it's heavily subsidized, of course, but on top of that, there are certain other issues as well, which is very endemic and systemic in nature. For instance, I mean, up to 300, I mean, we all know there are almost half of our energy is consumed by residential customers. And within that, up to 70% is actually consumed by consumers, which has a consumption pattern of up to 300 units. So that is something where the limitation of the system comes. And up to 300 units is somewhere there's a lot of political consideration that needs to be made, and it is very price sensitive. If the government decide to subsidize that, definitely some other sectors, some other category of consumer need to take a fall for it. That is unfortunately the industrial. So let me tell about the industrial. So industrial is about, in terms of consumer, they're about 1% of total, but it consumes about 25% of whole generation. Delivering energy to them is actually at a very least cost. And it is not. It is very easy to provide, I don't know, 10 megawatt of electricity to a single user than 10 megawatts spread across different residential units. So it has that economy of scale and everything. But unfortunately, because of that systemic issue, we have unfortunately not been able to increase the industrial base. What has actually increased is primarily the residential sector. And within that residential, up to 300 unit category of consumer is still contributing a lot. Unless that is changed, I don't think so the overall pricing regime is going to be changed if keeping everything else constant. But definitely that is time consuming, because this directly relates to the economic vision the government and the state have in the years to come. That is not going to change overnight, but there are some structure changes that could be made in order to reduce the power generation cost. That relate to actually the distribution and the pattern of pricing at the distribution level. But the generation is something we can always start.
But Salman Sahab, let me ask. I mean, these are things that probably some demand agency or the ministry should be thinking about. How does NEPRA regulate the sector? That's the key issue. I mean, to you, it shouldn't matter whether industrial, residential, जो भी आप regulate कैसे करती है? और pricing जो है, आपका जो system है, वो मतलब मुझे समझ नहीं आ रही. ठीक है, लाइफलाइन कंज्यूमर्स हैं, तो वो हुकूमत उनको सब्सिडी दे रही है वहां से, बिस्प से. बाकी जो है स्ट्रक्चर मुझे समझ नहीं आ रही 300 500 600 700 मेगावाट्स का क्या है एंड व्हाई शुड देयर बी डिफरेंस बिटवीन कमर्शियल रेजिडेंशियल एंड इंडस्ट्रियल ये मुझे समझ नहीं आ रही ये क्या चक्कर है कुछ बताइए
अच्छा इस तरह है कि हमारी ओवरऑल प्राइसिंग जो है ना इट डेफिनेटली वो डिफरेंट टियर पे होती है इफ यू टॉक अबाउट जनरेशन नॉर्मली थ्री डिस्टिंक्ट एस्पेक्ट्स से होती है
रेगुलेशन की बात करें
रेगुलेशन इटसेल्फ जो है ना हमारे स्टैंडर्ड प्रोसीजर जनरेशन के रूल्स ऑलरेडी अवेलेबल हैं जिसके तहत जो है ना हम कॉस्ट प्लस रिजीम के तहत नॉर्मली टैरिफ देते हैं व्हिच मींस कि एक प्रूडेंटली इंकर्ड कॉस्ट जो एक अपनी रेगुलेटर अपने असेसमेंट करता है उसके ऊपर एक रिटर्न दे देते हैं दूसरा ऑप्शन कंपैरेटिव है कंपैरेटिव में बहुत कम प्लांट्स हमारे पास अभी इनफैक्ट उनकी सीओडीज हो चुके हैं अलबत्ता एक्सपोर्ट ऑप्शन को कर रहे हैं तो बाय एंड लार्ज हाउ जनरेशन सेक्टर वर्क्स एंड डेफिनेटली जनरेशन की प्राइसिंग इफेक्ट कर लिए ओवरऑल आपकी जो डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन पे तकरीबन 70-80% प्लस जो है ना वो आपका पावर परचेज कॉस्ट होती है उसकी प्राइसिंग अंडरस्टैंड करना भी बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है क्योंकि वही आगे जाके जिसमें डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन मार्जिन लगता है डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन कंपनीज का और उसके बाद ये कैटेगराइजेशन होती हैं तो कैटेगराइजेशन जितनी भी है वो तो ओवरऑल एक ऑलरेडी गिवन है और उसमें कॉस्ट ऑफ सर्विस के बेस पे ये होती हैं टेक्निकल लॉसेस वगैरह की स्टडीज होती हैं हमारी टीम विजिट्स करती हैं ये सारी चीज़ करने के बाद हमारे पास डिस्को वाइज टेक्निकल एंड कमर्शियल लॉसेस वगैरह की पूरी डिटेल्स हमारे पास आती हैं इसमें उसी के बेसिस पे हम ये प्राइसिंग करते हैं और डेफिनेटली प्राइसिंग में थोड़ा सा गैप इस सेंस में रहता है कि जो एक्चुअल लॉसेस हैं वो कॉरेस्पॉन्ड नहीं कर रही जो हमारे टारगेट्स वगैरह हैं इनफैक्ट थोड़ा सा पिछले साल से नंबर्स थोड़ा से वर्सन ऑफ हुए हैं मतलब इफिशिएंसी जो हमारी रिकवरी के रशेज हुए हैं वो तकरीबन 3% डिक्लाइन कर गए हैं एज अगेंस्ट 2019 के नंबर्स के मुताबिक और टी&डी लॉसेस भी बढ़ गए तो ये सारा डेफिनेटली जितना भी है ये ड्राइव करता है आपकी प्राइसिंग रिजीम्स को और उसी के मुताबिक हमें ये करते हैं अभी तो इनफैक्ट अभी ये यूनिफॉर्मिटी ऑफ टैरिफ भी आ गई जिसमें से पहले गवर्नमेंट डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन वाइज टैरिफ वगैरह होता था तो उसमें ज़रा इनएफिशिएंट डिस्कोर्स सामने आ जाती थी और इनएफिशिएंट जो थी वो भी सामने उसका भी हमें पता चल जाता था लेकिन अभी वो चीज़ें भी जो है मुश्किल होती जा रही हैं और गवर्नमेंट को यूनिफॉर्मिटी अभी लेके आ रहे हैं और उसकी वजह से प्राइसिंग का स्ट्रक्चर जो है ना वो चेंज होगा
देखिए यूनिफॉर्म प्राइसिंग तो हमेशा से थी सलमान साहब सिर्फ जो डिफरेंस है कि अब आप लोग यूनिफॉर्म टैरिफ नहीं दे सकते जो पहले दे सकते सॉरी डिफरेंशिएटेड टैरिफ नहीं दे सकते जो पहले दे सकते थे तो पहले जब आप डिफरेंशिएटेड टैरिफ देते थे तो हुकूमत का सर्कुलर डेट बढ़ता था तो मुझे तो जो सवाल मेरा है कि हाउ डज नेपरा रेगुलेट व्हाट आर द ऑब्जेक्टिव्स ऑफ योर रेगुलेशन आर द ऑब्जेक्टिव्स ऑफ योर रेगुलेशन जस्ट टू फिक्स द प्राइस और इज देयर क्योंकि नॉर्मली ऑब्जेक्टिव होता है फॉर एग्जांपल मैं सेंट्रल बैंकिंग में काम करता रहा हूँ ऑब्जेक्टिव ऑफ सेंट्रल बैंकिंग रेगुलेशन इज टू हैव अ सेफ and efficient banking system. आपकी क्या है objective regulation की and how is it that you achieve that objective? Central bank achieves their objective by going out and auditing banks and making sure that every day they get a balance sheet from every bank to see how they are operating.
अच्छा ये ओवरऑल तो देखिए हमारे रूल्स वगैरह जितने भी हैं उसके हवाले से हमारा एक्ट भी यही कहता है कि जाहिर बात एक्सक्लूसिव जुरिसडिक्शन नेपरा की है उसमें लेकिन इसमें हमें प्रूडेंसी का एक जजमेंट एक्सरसाइज करनी पड़ती है कि प्राइस फेयर हो अराइव थ्रू अ जुडिशियस प्रोसेस हो और नो रूम फॉर इंटरप्रिटेशन और ये क्लियर उसके साथ हो अलोंग विद टर्म्स एंड कंडीशन और इफिशिएंसी हमारे सेक्शन 7 के तहत ये ऑलरेडी एक्ट में डिफाइंड है इफिशिएंसी को फरोग दें और उन इन्वेस्टमेंट वगैरह की एक सफिशिएंट कॉस्ट जितनी भी मार्केट की होती है वेटेड एवरेज कॉस्ट ऑफ कैपिटल के मुताबिक वो डिटरमिन करने के बाद पास ऑन करें ओवरऑल ऑब्जेक्टिव तो यही है कि सस्टेनेबल एंड अफोर्डेबल प्राइस को इंश्योर किया जाए गिविंग द लिमिटेड रिसोर्सेज हर डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन कंपनी जो अपने पास लेके आती है अकॉर्डिंगली इसी को ड्राइव करते हुए अब हर साल पिटिशंस आती हैं प्लान्स आते हैं इंडिविजुअल डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन कंपनी वाइज टी&डी लॉसेस जो है वो सेट होते हैं रिकवरी तो ऑब्वियसली हम 100% पे एज्यूम करते हैं और ये प्राइस हो जाती है तो सस्टेनेबल एंड अफोर्डेबल अगर आप कहना चाहते हैं ऑब्जेक्टिव ये है और ये
फिर भी लाइन लॉसेस बढ़ रहे हैं और लॉसेस बढ़ रहे हैं कंपनीज के then is that not your responsibility to make sure that these line losses and the losses of the companies come down and what instruments do you have to make sure that happens?
نہیں دیکھیں یہ آپ کی بات بالکل صحیح ہے. ہم ایک ریگولیشن کے تحت ہم ایک پروڈنٹ اسیسمنٹ کرتے ہیں انڈیویجول ڈسٹریبیوشن وائز اس کی اتنی لاسز ہونی چاہیے. فار انسٹنس رائس کو کہ آج کل سنگل ڈیجٹس میں ہے, ہمیشہ ہی رہی ہے, ہارڈلی وہ 2 ڈیجٹ میں رہا ہے. وہ اگر ہم اسسمنٹ ٹی این ڈی لاسز کی کر لیتے ہیں, اگر کسی بھی طریقے سے ڈسٹریبیوشن کمپنی اس کو اور میٹ نہیں کرتی تو اس کی کاسٹ ہم پاس آن کنزیومر پہ نہیں کرتا. یہ تو ہمارا ایک بالکل کلیئر آبجیکٹو ہے کہ انیفیشنسی جو ہے نا وہ ہم کنزیومر پہ پاس آن نہیں کرتے. ابھی رہا کہ ڈسٹریبیوشن کمپنی کہیں تو یہ کاسٹ جائے گی, یہ کاسٹ اسینشلی گورنمنٹ پک کرتی ہے. اگر گورنمنٹ پک کرتی تو گورنمنٹ کے اس میں چلا جاتا ہے. لیکن ریگولیٹر اس کا الٹرنیٹو کیا تھا؟ دیکھیں ریگولیٹر ایک بینچ مارک سیٹ کرتا ہے, وہ بینچ مارک کو لیٹس اسیوم کنسسٹنٹلی وہ بریچ کرتے ہیں, بریچ ٹو دی ایکسٹینٹ آف ورس کرتے ہیں. تو ریگولیٹر کے پاس 2 آپشن تھے, یا تو پاس آن نہ کرنے دیں یا پاس آن کر کے کنزیومر ٹیرف بڑھا دیں. کنزیومر ٹیرف بڑھانے پہ بھی کوئی فائدہ تو اس وجہ سے نہیں ہے کہ وہ پرائسز بڑھیں گی. اس کے علاوہ نیپرا کے پاس اس طرح کوئی ٹول نہیں ہے جو کہ اس کی ایڈمنسٹریشن کو کنٹرول کر سکے.
کیا ٹول چاہیے آپ کو؟ what tool would you like to have?
دیکھیں
what tool do regulators have in other countries?
دیکھیں اس میں ایڈمنسٹریٹر کا آپشن جو ہے نا وہ تو ہمیشہ ہمارے فرینکلی رول میں بھی ہے, اگر میں نے پہلے کلیئر نہیں کیا. لیکن یہ اسینشلی یہ گورنمنٹ اونڈ ہے. تھوڑی سی لمیٹیشن اس سینس میں آتی ہے کہ گورنمنٹ is owning almost 70% of the whole sector. اس میں ایشو یہ ہے کہ گورنمنٹ فرام ٹائم ٹو ٹائم, یہ ہم کہہ چکے ہیں کہ پوسٹ انبنڈلنگ آف وابڈا جو ہے یہ کارپوریٹائز انٹیٹیز تو بن گئی تھی, لیکن اس میں کنٹرول پھر بھی گورنمنٹ کا رہا ہے اور ہے بھی. جب تک یہ کنٹرول انڈیپینڈنٹ کمپنی کے پاس نہیں جائے گا, ایسے بورڈ جو بااختیار ہو اور اس میں پرائیویٹ سیکٹر کی ریپرزنٹیشن زیادہ ہو, یہ ایشوز رہیں گے. جیسے آپ نے پہلے اپنے سٹارٹ میں پرولوگ میں کہا کہ اٹس اے گورننس کے ایشو ہے, یہ گورننس کا ایشو زیادہ ہے. تو یہ انفیکٹ میں اس کی 100% جو بھی بڑے یہاں پہ ہمارے بڑے سینئر پرانے کولیگ بھی ہیں وہ بیٹھے ہوئے ہیں, یہ سیکٹر کو 3-4 سال ریویو کرنے کے بعد یہ ریئلائزیشن ہو جاتی ہے کہ یہ گورنمنٹ کا ایشو زیادہ ہے. اس میں ہم گورنمنٹ کو فرام ٹائم ٹو ٹائم ہماری ایڈوائزری جاتی ہیں کہ یہ دس از ناٹ دا وے فارورڈ. اس کی پرائیویٹائزیشن کا, اس کی جو ہے نا گورننس کے ایشوز کا ڈسٹریبیوشن کمپنیز کو مینٹین کرنا پڑے گا. بیکاز ابھی 2019 سے 2020 واز سپوز ٹو بی ایک بہترین سال تھا. اس سینس میں ہم نے کنسیڈر کرنا تھا کہ دیکھیں ریئلائزیشن ہو گئی ہے, ڈسٹریبیوشن لیول پہ امپروومنٹ, لیکن ہم نے جو لاس لیول سیٹ کیے تھے وہ اس سے بھی ورس آئے ہیں. ہماری ریکوری 100% تھی, لیکن پچھلے سال کی ریکوری 90% ہے, ابھی وہ 87% پہ آ گئی. 3% لاس از لاٹ آف منی فرینکلی, کیونکہ 1.6 ٹریلین کا یہ سیکٹر ہے. 1% ہی از ایکچولی, تو یہ بہت سینسٹیو ہے ریکوری, تو وہ ورس ہو رہی ہیں. اس ورس میں فرینکلی اگر لا ہمیں اجازت دیتا ہے کہ ہم اگر آپشن یہ کہ ایڈمنسٹریٹر کر لیں, تو یہ 10 کی 10 کمپنی نیشنل لیول پہ ہم اگر آ بھی جاتے ہیں, ہم سے بھی یہ نہیں ہونا, کیونکہ ریگولیٹر کا کام نہیں ہے کہ ادھر جا کے ایڈمنسٹریشن اور مائکرو مینجمنٹ شروع. دو ہمارے لا میں پروویژن ہے, اس کا ایکسرسائز اوبویسلی ہماری کمپیٹنٹ اتھارٹی اگر چاہے تو ایکسرسائز کر سکتے, بٹ دیٹس ناٹ دی وے فارورڈ.
یہ سلمان صاحب اسٹیٹ بینک میں, سینٹرل بینکنگ میں, دنیا جہان میں, دس از این ایریا آئی ورکڈ ان ا لاٹ. آئی ہیو ایڈوائزڈ اباؤٹ God knows how many central banks, 20-30 central banks. Central banks میں ایک پروویژن ہمیشہ ہوتی ہے اور تھریٹ ہوتا ہے. جس دن لگے کہ کسی بینک نے شام کو 5 بجے 6 بجے جب بھی بینک کلوز ہوتا ہے, اگر بیلنس شیٹ نہیں بھجوائی اور سینٹرل بینک کو اس پہ کوئی خدشہ ہے, تو سینٹرل بینک اسی شام اسی دن اس بینک کو ٹیک اوور کر سکتا ہے اور اس کو تباہ کر سکتا ہے. تو آپ کے پاس یہ پروویژن ہے کہ نہیں ہے؟ کین یو ڈو دیٹ؟ کین یو KE فار ایگزامپل کراچی الیکٹرکس ہوئی تھی پرائیویٹائز, ڈیڈ یو ریگولیٹ اٹ ویل اور ناٹ؟ بتائیے.
دیکھیے کے الیکٹرک تو پرائیویٹائز ہوئی تھی. کے الیکٹرک جو ہے نا وہ 2 سائڈ پہ گئے ہیں, مطلب اس کے پازیٹیو بھی ہیں کون بھی اس پرائیویٹائزیشن پروسیس پہ. ایٹ دا اینڈ آف دا ڈے 40% لاسز تھے, وہ تقریباً 19-20% پہ آ گئے ہیں. دیر از لاٹ روم ٹو امپروو. لیکن ہمارا مطلب میرا پرسنلی اوبویسلی یہ پوائنٹ آف ویو ہے کہ ہم اس کو, آپ نے جو بینکنگ کی مثال دی بھی, پرہیپس اس قسم کی چیزیں پاکستان میں بھی پاسبل ہے بینکنگ سیکٹر میں, لیکن یہ پاور سیکٹر ہے, اس میں لاکھوں کروڑوں عوام موجود ہیں. اس میں ایک پولیٹیکل ایلیمنٹ بھی ہوتا ہے, اس میں یونین وغیرہ کے ایلیمنٹ بھی ہوتا ہے, یہ کمپلیٹلی پبلک سیکٹر ہے. اس میں میرے کہنے کا مقصد یہ ہے کہ آپ زیادہ تر آپ کی جو پروونسز کی یوٹیلیٹیز ہیں, یہ اگر ریگولیٹر آ بھی جائے, ریگولیٹر اپنا CEO وغیرہ یہ سارا کرنے کے بعد بھی, یہ ایشو ایسا ہے, یہ کافی سسٹیمک ہے. اس میں آپ کو اوور آل چینج کرنے کی, پوری مائنڈ سیٹ چینج کرنے کی ضرورت ہے. اگر ریگولیٹر اس میں باک ڈاؤن ہو جائے تو اس میں ڈیلی ایڈمنسٹریشن پہ تو یہ بڑا مشکل ہو جائے گا. اور دو لو موجود ہے, لیکن یہ اس قسم کی پرائیویٹائز چیزیں نہیں ہیں جہاں پہ یہ بینکنگ, یہاں پہ ایک پرائیویٹائزیشن کا پروسیس ہوا, اس کے بعد بینکنگ پرائیویٹائز ہوئی, ایک بڑا روبسٹ ریگولیٹر اسٹیٹ بینک کی شکل میں موجود ہے, اس میں ہو سکتی ہے. یہاں پہ یہ نہیں ہوئی. اور یہاں پہ اگر میرے اپنے خیال میں اگر ریگولیٹر اس کا رول پلے بھی کرتا ہے تو اس کو شاید پھر بھی پرابلمز ہوں گے, شاید اس لیول کے نہیں ہوں گے لیکن وہ ہوں گے. تو یہ حل یہ نہیں ہے کہ ایڈمنسٹریشن پہ ریگولیٹر آ کے کر لے اور اس کے پاس میجیکلی یہ اس طرح چینج ہو جائے. یہ the problem will still be.
ایک اور سوال, آج جو سرکولر ڈیٹ کی پوزیشن ہے, کیا آپ کے نیپرا کے حساب میں آج سرکولر ڈیٹ کی پوزیشن کیا ہے؟
نیپرا جو لیٹسٹ نمبر ہے میرے خیال میں اگست تک یہ 2.2 ٹریلین تک یہ پہنچ گیا ہے انفارچونیٹلی.
Do you have up to date daily information on what the circular
ڈیلی تو نہیں, میں نے فرینکلی کچھ اپنے کولیگز وغیرہ سے ہم نے لیا تھا, CPPA وغیرہ سے, ان کے بعد جو نمبر ہے وہ تقریباً 2.2 ٹریلین کے قریب ہے.
Because this is another difference between central banking and the regulation in Pakistan. Central bank has the loss or the profit of the banking system or whatever every day, not that they are waiting. They know every day the position of the banks and they're ready to take effect. تو ہمارے ہاں یہ نہیں ہے. So let me ask Amina Suhail. Amina, آپ کا کیا خیال ہے? What do you suggest? What do you say to what Salman Rahman sahab has very aptly summarized NEPRA ki position on regulation and pricing? What's your take?
Sir, Madam Amina hasn't joined, sir.
Hasn't joined. Okay. Shahid Sattar sahab, you wanted to say something? Then let me come to Bisharat Chima.
جی I'm sorry it took me time to unmute. بشارت صاحب کو obviously sir first of all the circular debt position جو ہے وہ تو دور کی بات, ان کو تو ڈیلی لوڈ شیڈنگ پوزیشن بھی نہیں آتی نیپرا کو.
چلے وہ چھوڑے, just talk about regulation and pricing. What should we do? What is regulation pricing? What should we be doing?
دیکھیں sir, regulation and pricing is derived from the overall plan or the design of the system. جب تک آپ کا ڈیزائن کاسٹ پلس پہ ہے and it does not take into account market driven competitive issues, اس وقت تک یہ ایشوز آتے رہیں گے. No amount of administrative setups can determine the real price of a product. باقی طاہر صاحب کو میں
چیمہ صاحب, طاہر بشارت چیمہ صاحب. Chima Sahab can't unmute himself, I think. Chima Sahab, unmute. جی چیمہ صاحب.
جی کیا میری آواز اب صحیح آ رہی ہے؟
بتائیے.
کیا میری آواز سنائی دے رہی ہے جی؟
بالکل آواز سنائی دے رہی ہے. ذرا بتائیے ریگولیشن کا نظام کیا ہونا چاہیے, کیا اس کو چینج کریں؟
جی میں عرض کرتا ہوں, لیکن اس سے پہلے کہ اسپیسیفکلی میں پرائسنگ اور ریگولیشنز پہ آؤں اور آپ کا سوال جو ہے وہ سامنے رکھوں, یہ بڑا ضروری ہے کہ ہم نے دیکھنا ہے کہ اس وقت جو آرکیٹیکچر ہمارے پاس ہے پرائسنگ کا یا اس سیکٹر کا وہ ہے کیا. تو یہ لیگیسی ہے اس وقت کی جب سوشل ویلفیئر واز موسٹ امپورٹنٹ, اور کیونکہ اسٹیٹ ہر چیز پرووائڈ کر رہا تھا, جنریشن بھی وہی لا رہا تھا, ٹرانسمیشن کے پروجیکٹس بھی وہ لاتا تھا, اس کے بعد ڈسٹریبیوشن لائنز بھی وہی بناتا تھا, اور ایک لحاظ سے دیکھا جائے تو MLDAs وغیرہ بھی سامنے نہیں تھے, تو لوکل ریسورسز سے کام ہوتا تھا. اس لیے آپ یہ کہہ لیجئے کہ اس میں انرجی ڈیفیشنٹ رجیم تھی وہ. تو سب سے پہلے تو اس میں یہ فیصلہ کیا گیا کہ کس طریقے سے گزارا کرنا ہے. تو اس گزارے کی خاطر ہماری جو ٹیرف کی فارمولیشن تھی اس کے لیے لوڈ سپریشن ٹیرف فارمولیشن جو اسکیم ہے وہ لے کے آئے. اب وہ کیا تھی؟ وہ یہ تھی کہ کسی طریقے سے زیادہ استعمال کو پرائس آؤٹ کیا جائے. تو اس کی طریقہ کار منترا واز جتنا آپ کم استعمال کریں گے اتنے پیسے کم دیں گے، اور جتنا آپ زیادہ استعمال کریں گے اس کے پیسے زیادہ دیں گے. تو یہ اس وقت کی ضرورت تھی، نمبر 1. اور نمبر 2، جیسے میں نے پہلے کہا کہ اسٹیٹ جو تھا وہ ویلفیئر کی طرف دیکھ رہا تھا، اس لیے اس نے یہ سوچا کہ کانسیپٹس لائک جسے کہتے ہیں کہ لائف لائن کسٹمرز، یہ تو کانسیپٹ پہلی دفعہ آیا. اس کے بعد انہوں نے یہ کہا کہ یہ سلیبنگ کی بھی ضرورت ہے، اور سلیبنگ جو ہے وہ بالخصوص جو ہے وہ لوڈ سپریشن ماڈل کا حصہ ہے، کہ جس میں the lesser you use the less you pay and more the use the more you pay. تو اب یہ دیکھیں آرکیٹیکٹ جو ہے آرکیٹیکچر جو تھا ہمارے سسٹم کا وہ تھا ہی ایک مختلف پریمائس پہ. تو جس وقت ہم اسے لے کے آئے کہ یہ ریگولیٹڈ ایک رجیم ہوگی اور اس میں پرائیویٹ انویسٹمنٹس بھی ہوں گی وغیرہ وغیرہ، تو یہ سب سے پہلے آرکیٹیکچر کو چینج کرنا چاہیے تھا. آرکیٹیکچر جب چینج نہیں ہوا تو اب آپ دیکھ رہے ہیں کہ آدھا تیتر اور آدھا بٹیر ہے. اب ہو یہ رہا ہے کہ وہی سلیبس چل رہے ہیں، جبکہ سمجھ نہیں آ رہی حکومت پاکستان کو اور پبلک جو پاور سیکٹر کے مینیجرز ہیں کہ وہ بجلی بیچیں کیسے. بات ہو رہی ہے کہ ہم کیپیسٹی ٹریپ میں پھنس گئے ہیں، اس کے بعد گلٹ ہے. یہ اور بات ہے کہ میں اس سے اتفاق نہیں کرتا، آرٹیفیشل گلٹ ہے کیونکہ ملک میں ریونیو بیسڈ ایک لوڈ شیڈنگ ہو رہی ہے. لیکن اگر ہم مان لیتے ہیں کہ واقعی اس وقت جو ہے گلٹ ہے، تو پھر یہ جو پلر ہے پرانے آرکیٹیکچر کا جس میں یہ ہے کہ لوڈ سپریشن ماڈل ہے ٹیرف کا، اس کو ختم کیوں نہیں کیا گیا؟ اس طرف کسی نے سوچا بھی نہیں. تو بیسکلی یہ ہے کہ انسٹیٹیوشنل میموری جو ہے اس کو اب ہر 5 سال کے بعد I'll use the right word اسے پرج کر دیا جاتا ہے تاکہ وہ غائب ہو جائے اور ایمنیجیا کے ساتھ ہم آگے چلیں. ہمیں پچھلی کوئی بات نہیں پتہ ہونا چاہیے، اور جو نئے ارسطو اس سیکٹر میں آتے ہیں وہ اسے چلانے کی کوشش کرتے ہیں. یہ تو ہو گیا جی پرانے آرکیٹیکچر کی اور پرائسنگ کی وجہ سے. اب دیکھنا یہ ہے کہ جو ریگولیٹر نے کیا پرائسنگ کے سلسلے میں وہ کیا کیا. تو the taste of the pie remains in its eating. کیا لوگ کسٹمر سیٹسفائیڈ ہیں؟ کیا ان کی جو بائنگ پاور ہے اس کے مطابق ہے؟ کیا جو آن لوکر ہے اس کو یہ سمجھ آتی ہے کہ پرائسز صحیح ہیں، یہ پرائسز کہیں زیادہ نہیں ہیں؟ تو اب اس پہ میں I'll refer back to what شاید ستار said، وہ یہ ہے کہ جب کاسٹ پلس جو میتھڈالوجی ہے اگر اس پہ جائیں گے تو ایک لحاظ سے بہت سے لوگوں کے ہاتھ بند جاتے ہیں. یہیں ریگولیٹر کا کام آتا ہے کہ کاسٹ پلس کے اندر جو ہڈن چیزیں ہیں یا ایسی اس قسم کی بیچ میں چیزیں ہیں کہ جو کسی بھی جسے کہتے ہیں سٹاپیج پہ یا کنسٹرکشن پہ آرام سے رہتی نہیں، بیچ میں سے نکل جاتی ہیں، انہیں یہ روکے. تو ہم نے یہ دیکھا ہے اسپیشلی جب آپ نے آئی پی پیز کے ساتھ جو آپ نیگوسیشنز ہوئیں اور اس کے بعد ایم او یوز سائن ہوئے، تو ہمیں یہ پتہ چلا کہ اس میں کیسز کنفرمڈ ہیں جن میں اوور انوائسنگ ہے. یہ ہمارے سامنے مانا گیا. یہ اور بات ہے کہ کہا گیا کہ اسے اس وقت ٹیکل نہیں کریں گے، بعد میں دیکھیں گے. اور اگر اسے ٹیکل کرنا بھی ہے تو ہم ریٹرن آن انویسٹ ہے جو انویسٹمنٹس ہیں یا ایکوٹی پہ جو ریٹرن ہے اسے ریڈیوس کریں گے، تو ایک ہی لحاظ ہو گئی کہ ہم نے اسے جو پیڈڈ کاسٹ ہے اسے ہم نے کم کر دیا. ایک چیز یہ بھی پروو ہو گئی. اس کے بعد ہم نے یہ دیکھا کہ انڈیکسیشنز جو غلط دی گئی تھیں اس سلسلے میں ریگولیٹر نے تو آج تک بولا ہی نہیں. اس نے یہ سمجھا کہ بہترین کام ہو گیا، فیصلہ ہو گیا، اور اس کے بعد ہم اس فیصلے کے پابند ہیں. فار دا گڈ آف دا پیپل ہم ہیں ہی نہیں ہے، نہ سیکٹر کے گڈ کے لیے. ابھی جیسے مائی گڈ فرینڈ سلمان رحمان نے بھی بتایا کہ ہم ایک ہیلدی بیلنس بھی رکھتے ہیں اینڈ فار دا گڈ آف دا سسٹم چلتے ہیں، جو کہ ریگولیٹر کا کام بھی ہے. اس وقت بھی نہ ہوا. پھر اس کے بعد اس رپورٹ میں ہمیں یہ پتہ چلا کہ انوائسنگ جو ہے اس میں بھی کیلکولیشنز کی اور ادروائز مسٹیکس ہیں جو سی پی پی اے جی سے وہ نکل گئیں، اس طرف دیکھا ہی نہیں گیا، وہ بھی سامنے آ گیا. اس کے بعد جو بہت عرصے سے شور مچایا جا رہا تھا کہ لوگ فیول بچا رہے ہیں اور فیول سے وہ بلینز بنا رہے ہیں، وہ بھی سامنے آ گیا کہ جی وہ آج کے بعد جو ہے وہ گینز جو ہیں 30-70 کی ریشو سے بانٹے جائیں گے. تو ریگولیٹر کیا کر رہا تھا؟ اس لیے کہ اب ریگولیٹری رجیم میں سب آ چکے ہیں. اب یہ کسی اور کا کام نہیں ہے، ریگولیٹر ہی کا کام ہے کہ یہ کیا ہو رہا ہے. اور جیسے آج کوشچن بھی ریز ہوا کہ آڈٹ کا کیا بنے گا، آڈٹ کریں گے یا نہیں کریں گے، جو پہلے دن کوئی چیز لکھ دی وہ ایسے ہی ہوگی یا نہیں ہوگی. अच्छा, इसके बाद यहाँ बात नहीं खत्म होती। इसके बाद जब हम आगे जाते हैं तो पता ये चलता है कि 20 ऐसे फैसेट्स हैं जो आईपीपीज पीपीएस में थे, उनको हम हैंडल नहीं कर सके। वो जिन्होंने ओरिजिनली नेगोशिएट किया, अगर वो साथ मिली भगत थी या फॉर दैट मैटर उन्हें पता ना लगा, तो इतनी बड़ा एक इदारा बनाया गया, रेगुलेटर से बनाया गया, उसने उसे देखा ही नहीं। तो मकसद मेरा ये हुआ कि इसी
Sorry to
पॉइंट
interrupt. Sorry to interrupt, sir. There are few foreigners here, sir.
में few
अच्छा,
problems.
sorry, foreigners जी, so please speak in English जी.
अच्छा,
You must not carry
I'll
English with
try
them.
my best, sir.
Okay. No.
I'll try my best.
Fair enough, fair enough.
अच्छा, तो we saw that we are following the earlier architecture, which was based on governmental social welfare for the people of Pakistan, one, and because there was a persistent shortage of energy, especially electricity in the country, and which according to them was going to live with us. So they said, let's have a load suppression model. And we went into the regulatory regime. We left the earlier regime, but we retained the earlier architecture. So you can imagine what happens. Ada itar, ada bater. You cannot run an aeroplane just on the motorway. It has to fly, and it has to be made to fly. You just can't say, okay, we'll just roll it on the motorway between Lahore and Islamabad or whatever, right? So this is the main problem. Now coming over to the efficiency or the efficacy of the system itself. I mean, I'm talking of the GENCOs, the National Transmission and Dispatch Company, and of course, the DISCOs. We see that the GENCOs are working below par. They're not maintaining their efficiencies. They have not been able to spend monies on O&M. They have not taken up any R&D so that the existing plants could improve upon their efficiencies and capacities. There are bottlenecks in the transmission system, and the DISCOs, they are not working at all. Imagine the regulator on its own, of course, at the insistence of the then government, redid the targets for the DISCOs in late 2016. I'll just give you an example. In 2016, the DISCOs were to maintain 13.5% losses. And the next year in 17, it should have come down by half a notch or one notch, say 12.5 to 13%. And on the insistence of the then government, it increased the loss level to 16.5% and also reduced the collection. So that means what? The regulator, instead of staying put on its journey towards more efficiency, was able to agree to what the government said, and it increased the loss level, also reduced the collection percentage, meaning thereby it jacked up the consumer end tariff by, you will not believe it, by 27% in one go. So it's like that. So I see that the regulator has not been able to regulate the system, whatever the reasons be, and it is not a regulatory regime which has placed the sector in a straitjacket. It is not a regulatory regime where it is semi-straitjacket. And lastly, it is not even allowing the sector to be independent on a free float. So it is somewhere in between and oscillating between a straitjacket and a free float. I don't know how, but it all depends upon the whims of the managers of the power sector, which remains, it used to be the Water and Power Ministry, and now it is the Power Division, or the regulator itself. So what happens is the DISCOs are not delivering. They're not delivering on the quality of supply. They're not delivering on the quantity of supply, and they're not even delivering on the pricing of the same. Now, coming back to another point, what was the position of these DISCOs, I mean their collection and loss level, let us say 12 years ago? I'm talking of not 12 years, but 15 years ago. I'm talking about the period between 2000 and 2005. This was because before terrorism struck this country. Before that, you'll be really surprised to know it that HESCO, which was looking after the whole of Sindh province, had a collection figure of plus 85%. Now the average collection of HESCO and SEPCO, these are the two distribution companies servicing the province of Sindh, the collection or the AT&C losses are anything between 38 to 42%. That means the collection and losses put together are just 60% from the high 80s like 15 years ago. Similarly, if you move over to KESCO, Quetta Electric Supplier Company, which services the Baluchistan province, there the collection is very lowly 42%, and the losses, you cannot imagine the level of the losses. Similar is the position in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. It's a little better in the Punjab, but if we take care of, I mean, if we look into the working of MEPCO, we'll see that it has great losses, and the losses being suffered by LESCO, not in the percentage, but in unit wise, are much more than what is being lost in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and like 1.3% of what is being lost in the province of Sindh. So if we look into percentages, it's a different story, but if we straight away discuss the unit figure, the loss in unit figure, it is stupendous. So what happens is, the main requirement for us in order to move forward is to change the architecture of the pricing and tariff in Pakistan. If we have a glut, the more you use, the less you pay, which is prevalent over the whole world. That needs to be taken care of. And as Dr. Nadimul Haq said, he was very straight about it. He said that the regulator must regulate, one, come up with the right cost of supply, okay, and then leave it to the government. It's for the government to pay a part of it. It doesn't matter if they wish to subsidize the whole thing and do not want to take even a pie from the people of Pakistan, fine, but the regulator should not worry about it. There was a clear-cut clause in the NAPRA Act that there will be no cross-tariff subsidy. There will be no cross-tariff subsidy. And similarly, meaning thereby that the high-end distribution, high-end domestic consumer or the commercial consumers are not going to, I repeat, underwrite the lifeline customer or some other category like the tube wells and all that, agricultural customers. Actually, it is for the government. If the government wishes, it is a socio-political or a socio-economic decision, then the government must pitch in. They can do it. They can do whatever they want to, but the regulator should not worry about it. So, meaning thereby that the architecture must change. And then there was another question from Dr. Nadeemul Haq. He said, why don't you simply come up with a differential tariff and let the government decide what happens? So the first time we had differential tariffs for all the discos, that was in 2010-11. So that was the time when the government decided to pick up and enforce the tariff which was lowest in all the companies, while it decided to pay off the differential for the other companies. Good enough, it doesn't matter, at least the sector would work perfectly. Now, another example, Dr. Nadeemul Haq asked the question about K Electric, which was known as the KESE, and asked what the regulator was doing. The regulator had an answer that it is a private entity, it has its own problems, and it's very difficult to take care of it, forgetting that 25% of K Electric's share is owned by the government of Pakistan, which has 3 directors on its 13-member BOD. We may think that the K Electric is not working, but did the regulator take up the issue with the government of Pakistan, which owns 25% of K Electric? So it is responsible for the working of K Electric. K Electric must work. Did those 3 directors, governmental directors on the K Electric BOD, ever took up this case or cause before the K Electric BOD for correction? They haven't done anything. and the regulator has not asked them. So I conclude that the pricing is wrong, it is erroneous, it is based on wrong premise, and it is trying to fix up an old architecture which has nothing to do with the regulatory regime of today. And similarly, the regulator is unable to take care of its regulatory obligations when it comes to the GENCOs, the NTDC and the DISCOs. And the DISCOs are nearly in a free float. I mean, if they are able to do something, they do it. If they don't do it, they simply tell that we have not been able to do it. Remembering that only 15 years ago, these companies were performing to quite a good standard. And it has only been during the last 15 years that they have gone back. Now, coming back to another point, which is very important. It was in a webinar like a month ago when I informed everybody that we researched into the whole issue. We conducted a study and we found that the HDI of a particular area, the per capita income of districts over there, the amount of investment in the power sector in that particular area, and the writ of the state has a strong bearing on the efficiency of these companies. Did the regulator ever do such a study? Did the regulator ever look into it and see what exactly were the reasons? Did it ever come up with a solution before the government, the owner of the power sector, to take care of the things? Did it ever ring a bell or raise a flag against what the IPPs were doing? I mean, it was the government itself now, last year, which took up this cudgel and they said that the IPPs need to be taken care of. So all in all, we see that the pricing is wrong, needs correction. Similarly, the regulatory obligations are not being met. Consequently, the power sector does not operate, it does not serve its clientele, and there are no chances in the near future that the things would improve. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Chima Sahab, as usual, very clear and very, very wonderful analysis. Let me bring in Amina Sohail. I think Amina is back. Then I'll come back to you, Salman Sahab, to address some of these issues. So Amina Sahib, are you there?
I would like
Yeah,
to respond back to what
Of course.
I've said after Amina Sohail.
After Amina ji. Hanji. Amina, go ahead.
right, sure. Can you all hear me?
We can hear you very well.
Yeah. Right. I've seen the agenda, and out of those talking points, I had suggested to Afia that I would like to discuss the role of NEPRA in the reform process and how much it has been able to maximize welfare to the consumers and its role in enhancing efficiency. So I think these basically have also been the concluding remarks, like in his own opinion, that Chima Sahab was of the view that unfortunately we do not see any regulation as such going on in our country. And as far as the role of NEPRA to maximize welfare of consumers, just don't ask about it. In terms of the losses that we are seeing and efficiency, of course, he didn't really touch in that sense. But efficiency from consumer perspective definitely means higher performance, that they are good in providing a qualitative service. I would just like to also, to start with, highlight that today's topic points, or the mood points, they start from the generation tariff, and then we fall on to the distribution issues. So unfortunately, and rightly pointed out by Chima Sahab, that we embarked upon a regulatory journey in 1995 via an ordinance, which later became an act in 1997. But unfortunately, the transition path that had to be crafted and designed parallel to the law that was put in place was not somehow was there. Um, I've also served in the telecom sector, and in fact, it was out of an intrigue as to how regulation in telecom has paid off, not only in our country, but around the world. So partly it is attributed to the technical, characteristics. You can't hear me?
No, we can hear you very well. Goli, Goli.
Okay, sorry. I just saw some, gestures from your side, so I
No,
thought
no,
maybe I'm not
just
clear.
adjusting
Anyway,
my own system.
right. Yeah. So, I was just saying that apart from the technical, differences that are distinctions that are there between the telecom and the power sector, uh, the problem that electricity is a highly politicized subject. The role of government is too eminent, and also the ownership of the entities who are not only generating, of course, earlier when we started off with this path of regulation, the ownership of the government was more, but slightly lesser now with the introduction of successive introduction of IPPs. But the question remains that how that electricity that is generated by a mix of public and private plants gets distributed to the consumer doorstep is the distribution company. And the distribution, all of the distribution companies are owned by government. Uh, the issue that how NEPRA can take part in the reforms is uh, effective regulation by going by the book. But unfortunately, no doubt that they've been failing on the earlier law. Soon after the 2018 amendment, there have been certain further obligations that have been put in place for NEPRA to observe. But neither they've been able to fulfill their own responsibilities in the previous law. And what I've been informed during discussions with various NEPRA professionals, that the new amendments were also sort of just thrusted upon the regulator. There has been a consultation process. And as Bisharat Saab was mentioning about cost of service-based tariffs, there is this requirement under the new law that there has to be a uniform tariff. Unfortunately, earlier, it was the government's unwritten policy, and it was not in the law as well. It was simply a policy that government used to adjust tariffs, and there used to be two notifications. One notification of the NEPRA approved tariff, and the second notification, which was taking account of the subsidies that the government wanted to pass on to various consumers. However, after the 2018 amendment, under section 31(4), there is this responsibility, this is fixed responsibility on the government, on the regulator to determine a uniform tariff. So this uniform tariff is, I think, is unjust. Despite the fact it says that subject to various other previous provisions of that very section, which calls for marginal appreciation of marginal cost, principles, giving due weightage to the financial sustainability of those companies. But these are some very opposite direction. The mandate that is being given to the regulator are too different. And so at one point, the regulator is being asked to take care of certain issues whose direction goes into the east, and on the other side, by way of asking them to determine a uniform tariff, they are supposed to act and move in a totally opposite direction. So these are some of the very hardcore issues present in the law itself. Because when the law sets a direction which is not really, you can say, is irrational and it is unjustified, so how can you expect a regulator to act in a rational manner? Because definitely it's a regulator that has to go by the book. So they've got all the justification to act in one way or the other as they interpret it. Currently, I'm working on an assignment where they are determining wheeling tariff. Now, wheeling is another opportunity where NEPRA can do something to ease pressure on the bulk power consumers by giving them an opportunity to take power from wherever they want. And it was not just, it's a new move. It introduced by the government in its 2006 renewable energy policy, and it's that only that the regulatory framework was not really in place. So right now, despite the fact that NEPRA now wants to do it, and as per their the determinations and decisions, that there is this pressure from the government as well to make it happen. But the problem is that they don't have cost available, which could identify that this service is going to cost this much and that service is going to cost that much. So whenever a BPC gets off the system, so what are the various costs that this BPC were earlier contributing, particularly costs relating to capacity payments to IPPs, because earlier all the consumers were being just divided, all these capacity payments were divided on all the consumers. But how they were being divided, it was again a very a lopsided formula that NEPRA has been adopting and still is adopting the same thing. So what I mean to say that you've been unable to do your job under the earlier law, and now under the current situation when there is a totally different law and it demands something more than what you've been demanded earlier. So I think there are problems at the level of the executive as well. The people who form policy on behalf of the government. So nobody realizes that why we are in this mess at the moment. Things are not getting better, as Bashar Saab also mentioned. So then what's the fun of adopting this regulatory path? Because regulation all over the world has been adopted as a matter of bringing in efficiencies, lowering tariffs. So all of these benefits we are not seeing. So isn't there a role? And NEPRA has a strong advisory role as per their law as well. Being a lawyer myself, I would not ask or expect NEPRA to do something which they are not required to do under the law. So whatever at least they are required to do under the law, unfortunately, they've been unable to do that. They've not been falling onto that path. So if they have failed earlier, I wonder what.
Amina, can I raise a question here?
Yeah, sure, please.
Can I ask you, ये जो आपने कहा लॉ चेंज होती है बार बार और नेपरा को कंफ्यूज कर दिया जाता है, ये प्रेशर कहाँ से आता है लॉ चेंज करने? Is it from the court? Is it from the executive? Is it from the donors? Is it from the consumers? Is it from the parliament? कहाँ से ये प्रेशर आता है to change the law?
Right. You see, what I feel is that somehow our power sector has mostly been governed under the advices of multilateral donor agencies, be that Asian Development Bank, World Bank, and other agencies. And there is less stress or less reliance on homegrown expertise. I remember you've also been in the Planning Commission, and you've been also, just striking your head against wall in terms of how fast we can move on the reforms agenda. So there is so much resistance to change. And all I have learned during my expertise, my experience in this sector, that unfortunately, no communication strategy has ever been adopted to bring people round to this idea. What good is there in this regulation? What benefits it can offer? So unless all the stakeholders are aligned, they are geared to achieve what this system can and may offer them, I think only then we can get to that level. One. Second, okay, there's a pressure. But since we haven't really developed that homegrown capability, or if there is one, nobody considers them valuable. So that's why you can see in the ministry, it has such a scarcity of expertise. Normally they rely on experts from one donor agency to the other donor agency. From my experience, I can tell you that this very law that has come up, people openly blame that it has been copied from other jurisdictions. So what good a copied law can do to us? We have our own problems. So I was recently working on another concept of supplier of last resort. Now the new law says that there is going to be retail competition. And for that, they are dividing distribution among the wire business and the another electric power supplier who will be just dealing with the billing and metering. And this responsibility of supplier of last resort has been put on the electric power supplier. So, and I've read through the literature everywhere, and it says that it cannot be, because it's always the distribution company who is having the wires ownership who can be the supplier of last resort. So you can very well say that हमारे यहाँ कहा जाता है ना कि नकल के लिए भी अकल की जरूरत है. So unfortunately, whoever copied that, they forgot to align this very basic concept that the supplier of last.
Let's quickly go back to Salman Rahman Sahab to take up some of these issues. Then Salman Sahab, I'll have to come back to some of the people.
Yeah,
so
sure, please.
Salman Sahab, would you take up some of these issues, but very quickly because we have other people to get to?
So, I mean, definitely what Amina said, I reckon it, agree with it in the sense that the government, I mean, needs to bring clarity what they want from the system and what they want from the regulator and how they want to, they foresee the sector. Important thing is that just like she said that it was previously a different differential tariff, but right now it has been made uniform tariff and it has been made a part of our legislation. So what that essentially means is that it is actually rolling back the reform process, which took place in the late 90s, sorry. So ISCO right now will be subsidizing PESCO, and because PESCO is a high loss territory, and so on and so forth. Efficiency, I don't know how can that be brought in the sector when there's a uniform tariff. Let me clarify that from time to time, definitely there are some correspondence which cannot be made public, and for the reason that it's between two entities. I just want to clarify to Chima Sahab that we have actually sent number of recommendation as a part of this, like Amina said, as a part of our job requirement. We have sent advisory to the federal government on different issues, including the governance issues of distribution companies from time to time, not just once, but many times. And a lot of them have actually reflected in the decision, which is available on our website, especially in terms of K Electric. K Electric come to us thrice recently, actually. Their multi-year tariff expired for a 7-year period, for a period of 7 years. They initially submit a tariff petition, and then we give them a decision. Then they came on the review. We give them another decision. Then the government come on their behalf. So in all those decisions, we have clearly stated that there are some certain aspects of previous incentive-based tariff which cannot be extended because they have come to a point where they have overcome the losses, which were at some point in 2005 around 40%. Right now, they're standing at 20%. So that is a success. Right now, it was incentive-based tariff. It wasn't just a cost-plus tariff. It was incentive-based tariff. The current tariff is also incentive-based tariff. So we're not necessarily restricting ourselves to the cost-plus tariff. Cost-plus, we understand, is probably not applicable in today's time. But it was when there was a demand-supply gap. We need to appreciate, and I'm sure Tahir Saab is a very seasoned expert in the sector. We do not necessarily appreciate the decision making that has been happening, that happened in the past, because they're not necessarily reflecting decisions. For instance, there was a demand and supply gap. When there's a demand and supply gap, and when we are told that the cost of not providing the power is 70, 80 rupees per kilowatt hour, that's reflected in World Bank and I think in IMF report as well. You need to bring generation. And obviously we don't bring generation, it's a government prerogative, it's a government through LOI and LOS given to different investors come forward to us and we give them a tariff. At that time, you cannot do a competition. When people are saying a lot of things about the coal-based power plants, but see, at those time, you need a base load capability plants, and that were unfortunately being provided by the RFO-based plant, which were actually very expensive. Right now, that is going away from the system, fortunately. In fact, our EPP is actually lower than the CPP. In the old days, EPP was 60-70% of your whole capacity purchase price. Right now, it's almost 50-50. So the impact of capacity payments are almost half, or at least more than what the energy purchase price is right now. But these things happen. So we have, from time to time, told the government about to bring clarity in the system. Government through this new act has actually sort of mandated us to give a uniform tariff, and we are actually accordingly proceeding. And in terms of the IPP's report and the outcome that has achieved through those MOUs, which has recently been signed, those IPPs were given tariffs on cost plus basis based in I think it was in 2005 and 2006. They came to operation 2009 to 2010. And within a few years, the regulator wrote letters that we are seeing excessive profits, and you need to explain that we were given a cost plus tariff with a certain agreed rate of return. And we've actually proceeded against them before the formation of this committee, which actually gave a report in the early part of this year. But they took a stay order against us, and we are still proceeding that. But I just want to clarify that NEPRA, from time to time, in its own resources, that actually took actions. But there's so much you can do. I mean, I agree that the point of the law which said the administration can be appointed, but in terms of bank, perhaps this is the easiest case. But for the power sector, when the whole sector is making laws, you cannot have an administration for every distribution company. That's not just practical. If 10 out of 10, only one were creating a problem, then the regulator can focus his attention on that particular discourse. But when the entire distribution sector has some systemic issues, which is like 70% owned by the government, so that, I mean, you need to be very judicious in exercising that option. And by the way, Shahid Sattar Saab said that we are not giving a lot of data. We are giving daily log sharing data by NPCC, and it has been happening, I don't know, for like last 5-6 years. And before that, there were limitations at the NPCC level because of automation issues. But right now, we do get those data.
Sir, is it on your website?
It is not. I think it is not on our website.
That's my point. I mean,
that's a different thing, but we get the data.
No, it's not a different thing. The thing is that I've worked in the sector. I know कि आप जितना data जिस तरह अभी मसलन आपने you sent out these forms for collection of data on circular debt. Have any of the companies responded to you?
Look, can you please repeat that, please? दोबारा बता सकते हैं?
Yes, what I said is the companies don't respond to you. You sent out these forms back in April or something like that for collection and verification of circular debt. None of the companies have responded with those forms to you. Now, my point is that you just don't have the data. Circular debt data, I mean, you were saying 2.2 trillion as if, and you don't really know. I know it's a lot more than that.
I mean, you must appreciate that those data are coming from. I mean, it's not organically generated from regulator. It's different institution responsible, different sort of data. So, I mean, the CPP as a relevant institution, we have asked them from time to time, and there was issue with the government with regards to what is the correct circular debt level position. And we are in a correspondence with the government, including the CPPAG, to get the circular data updated on periodic basis.
But Salman Saab, इसमें एक चीज, sorry. Salman Saab, देखिए, a regulator must have all the data. Otherwise, I don't know how you regulate. And the regulator's data must be available to researchers like us to be able to understand what's happening. So I think, quite frankly, I would urge you to make sure that the regulator has the data, because as I said, in the central banking, the day does not end before the central bank has all the data. And the next morning, the governor's central bank has a complete consolidated balance sheet of the banking system on his table before the business begins. If you don't operate like that, you're obviously not regulating. So I would urge that data is something you can't outsource to CPPAG or anybody. This is the regulator's job. But anyway, let's move on. Shahid Sattar Sahab, you had something that you wanted to share? Shahid, are you there?
I'll leave it till the end if there is time.
Okay, great. No problem. ठीक है जी. So let's go to Akhtar Hussain Javed Sahab. Akhtar Hussain Sahab.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम। मेरा क्वेश्चन ये है कि अभी रिसेंटली CTBCM जो कम्पिटिटिव ट्रेड का मॉडल जो है वो शायद नेपरा ने तक देख रहे हैं कि ये यानी कि इम्प्लीमेंट होगा और इम्प्लीमेंट होगा भी ये नहीं, और इसकी आगे क्या पावर सेक्टर के ऊपर अफेक्ट होने वाला है। That's it. That's my question.
Hassan Bhutto Sahab.
Nadeem, I'd like to have an opportunity to provide some comments.
Hello.
I can't see the
Hassan
hand
Bhutto
sign
Sahab, go
on
ahead.
my
जी सर,
machine. I
जी
can't-
सर, जी सर, मेरे एक छोटा सा कमेंट के साथ फॉलोड बाय क्वेश्चन था, बिकॉज ताहिर साहब बीइंग मेंटोर एंड सलमान बीइंग वेरी गुड फ्रेंड. सर्कुलर स्टॉक जो है 2 ट्रिलियन का और फ्लो बढ़ते हुए कॉम्पिटिटिव ये किस प्राइसिंग की बात कर रहे हैं? अफोर्डेबिलिटी और सस्टेनेबिलिटी के नारे गवर्नमेंट लगा रही है, और जो स्टेप्स हैं डिस्कोर्स पे प्राइवेटाइजेशन कहती है कि कंप्लीट प्राइवेटाइजेशन होनी है. नेपरा कहता है कि वायर एंड पोल को सेपरेट करके, अर्मीना ने कहा कि वो रेगुलेटेड कंज्यूमर ही रहना है, और नेपरा कहता है कि वहां पे कंपटीशन होनी है. वो बायलैटरल को और व्हीलिंग को लोग जो है डिफरेंट समझते हैं. लास्ट CTBCM के मैं इसमें हियरिंग में था, वो कहते हैं किसी ने किसी से सवाल पूछा नेपरा से ही कि डिस्को वाले आप लोग व्हीलिंग को तो कोर्ट में ले गए हो, लेकिन CTBCM को आप जो है होप्स के कोर्ट में नहीं ले जाओगे. तो भाई बायलैटरल भी वही है, जब व्हीलिंग ऑलरेडी कोर्ट में है तो इस CTBCM से हमें उम्मीदें क्या हैं? ये कंपटीशन इसके अंदर लफ्ज है, जहां कंपटीशन किस एरिया में है? होलसेल में तो जीरो नजर आ रही है. रिटेल अगर रेगुलेटेड ही रहनी है तो ये धोखा काय के लिए है. और फिर बायलैटरल अगर कोर्ट में है तो फिर बिफोर एंड आफ्टर CTBCM कुछ नजर तो नहीं आ रहा. फिर ये काय की एक एंगेजमेंट्स हैं. एक तो क्वेरी ये है. फिर दूसरा इसमें ये है कि अभी पेप्को की एक कहानी शुरू हो गई है जो कि 96 में 99 में स्टार्ट हुई आफ्टर वापदा. फिर 12 में वो दरवाजा बंद हुआ, कारपोरेट एंटिटीज जो है डिस्को बनी. अब उनको वो कॉर्पोरेट एंटिटीज अपनी जगह पे मैनेजिंग एजेंट जो है इसको बनाया गया है. और तो डिफरेंस क्या रहेगा? फिर अगेन MD पेप्को एंड देन CEO डिस्को सेक्रेटरी को रिपोर्टिंग हो, तो इससे एफिशिएंसी क्या होगी यार? मेरिली मैनेजिंग एजेंट की एक फी का इजाफा होगा, एक कॉस्ट सेंटर होगा और प्राइस बढ़ती जाएगी. फिर साथ में ये कुछ समझ में नहीं आ रहा कि सलमान ने EPP की बात की जो कि आज 5 रुपए है और कैपेसिटी 7 रुपए की है. दुनिया में 25 to 30% कैपेसिटी पेमेंट इज लोअर देन एनर्जी. फिर साथ में रेगुलेटर ये टैरिफ दिए जा रहे हैं. रिन्यूएबल पॉलिसी आ रही है जो कि 15 साल का टर्म और ऑक्शन करेगी. कल इन्होंने एग्रीमेंट करवाया है, ज़ेनफा का LOS हुआ है AEDB के साथ 100 मेगावाट का. बड़े नारे लगे हैं, लोग जो है ना डांस पार्टियां कर रहे हैं. तो फिर हम करने जा रहे हैं मार्केट. एक बात साइड पे बात कर रहे हैं कि मार्केट कंपटीशन की. मार्केट कंपटीशन में जब होलसेल की बात करते हैं तो लॉन्ग टर्म कॉन्ट्रैक्ट्स की बात नहीं होती है. और फिर दूसरा जो है इधर से हम 25 साल के कॉन्ट्रैक्ट. आखिरी नदीम साहब, आखिरी बात. रिसेंटली
सॉल्व करने
नहीं प्राइसिंग की बात हो रही है। जब आईजी सेप आपका आया तो नेपरा ने एक खत लिखा हुआ है, उसमें लिखा है कि 1500 मेगावाट ये भी हैं जिनको नेपरा ने टैरिफ दिया हुआ है, तो काइंडली इसको जो है ना कमिटेड कैटेगरी में डाल दें। अगर नेपरा उधर से कॉम्पिटिटिव मार्केट को भी फॉलो कर रहा है, फिर इधर से वो कह रहा है कि कमिटेड कैटेगरी में डाल, ये तजाद चल रहा है। क्लियर तो ना रेगुलेटर है ना पॉलिसी है, तो इसको अगर चीमा साहब और बाकी स्पीकर्स रिस्पॉन्ड कर दें।
Okay, fair enough. Amina Bibi, you had to say something?
Yeah, I just simply...
Can I just add also, how much of the fault lies with the courts and with lawyers? Because we are an over-lawyered society, everything goes to the court regardless of anything. I changed my curtains in my office and went to the court. Curtains change kar liya. And court actually took the petition ke curtain change kar liya. Mujhe samajh hi nahi aati kya ho raha hai. I mean, is this the kind of society we want to be? Does the court have any expertise in energy?
Not at all, not at all. And as far as the kind of regulatory literature, legal regulatory literature, we've been supporting. I have served NEPRA for over 7 years, and we've been trying to satisfy courts' appetite to intervene in every matter now and then. However, the problem lies where the lawyers are unaware and they're unable to make judges aware of their limits, of how far they can lay their hands on the decisions of NEPRA, or if the decisions of NEPRA are not really speaking orders. You see, the window of opportunity for courts to intervene in regulatory matters is very limited. And only if there is a process impropriety and there is lack of principles of natural justice. These are the only two avenues where a court's judicial scrutiny of NEPRA's decisions can be made. So, and I've alhamdulillah been able to defend in a lot of matters NEPRA. I used to appear as a counsel, and we've tried to satisfy judges. In fact, in one of the case, the current sitting judge of the Supreme Court, Ijazul Ehsan Saab, was our lawyer, and we made him understand as to how to express and explain the whole tariff system to the court, because unless the courts understand that what kind of a regulatory system it is, they can't really decide, and whatever they'll decide, they'll be just creating a new barricade or blockage of giving stay orders. And what stay orders do, they only avert the application of decisions and creating more cost for the system. So this is just for the court's intervention. Regarding the reforms one, if you may allow me, you see, I think we need to decide that how much mileage we can cover in a particular time. And let's go by milestone wise, because I was at NEPRA when we came up with the transitional arrangement order when the NTDC's license was granted, because the system of competition or the competition per se in the power sector cannot be introduced unless our wires are not freed from the clutches of old age bundled servicing. Because as long as these service would remain bundles, no matter we have created corporate entities, but they're still shackled. They are not really operating under the corporate system that the corporate law envisages. They might have boards, but those boards are not independent. They don't have any financial autonomy. So if the filers, be the NTDC or the distribution companies, are unable to identify their cost, or the regulator is unable to ask them to identify the cost they are putting up for providing ancillary services, for providing balancing services, for providing metering services, for providing billing services, you cannot create competition. Leave aside the generation competition. And as far as generation competition is concerned, I think NEPRA must be blamed, should be blamed, because it's acquiescence of the regulator and the government to give long-term contracts. We came up with NEPRA came up with interim power procurement regulations back in 2005. And there it had provided that there won't be long-term contracts. If there are long-term contracts, they would be justified. In regulatory literature, it is called round the clock. So these long-term contracts are round-the-clock contracts, because as Salman has explained, the capacity payments are becoming more than the energy payments, and the picture is really horrendous for the coming 2, 3, 5 years down the line. It is going to be really unbearable, and the government is currently, just banging its head against the wall in terms of tackling the circular debt issue. It needs to do something about the capacity payments. There has to be renegotiations with these IPPs, because this is what other countries have done. We are not the only country who is dealing with these capacity payments. Let's call spade a spade. These capacity payments, if not stopped today, are going to be a total bankruptcy for the power sector.
ठीक, okay. Rashid साहब, Rashid Aziz.
Ji, thank you, Nadeem. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Very categorically moved away from the topic itself, which was regulation and tariffs. But let me just, in that spirit, stay with. I would like to, first, Nadeem, I would like to comment on the first slide that you put up, 5, 6 subjects that we have learned. And I'm going to have to say, I'm sorry, I'm disappointed. I keep making this point in various, and I don't see that topic in there. I see things like we don't do enough research, or there is not enough clarity in research. There's not enough good planning, etc., etc. But that element which I pointed out a number of times, investment, whether it be in new capacity, whether it be in upkeep, or whether it be in improvement, investment or expenditure. Some of it is clearly, that topic doesn't figure. So therefore, even there I start with, the starting point is, we're talking part of the issues, we're not taking other aspects. And therefore, when we say, I pointed out a fault, we seem to be justified. We were looking at parts of the picture. Now to the topic at hand, in fact, I'm tempted to go back into a topic which I shouldn't be. But let me make this point. We have been told, even during the seminar, oh, they are donor driven, somebody else has written it, etc., etc. Amina Saiba, do you remember when the first discussions on the NEPRA Act were being done? Ijaz Ishaq, Ahmad Ataur Rahman, yourself, etc. You were the people who were providing all the inputs to the lawyers on the bank side. Is that an example of we do not take local views into account? Sorry, I do not think so. But anyway, that's a topic at hand, tariff setting and electricity pricing. We heard right at the outset, Salman and Tahir Chima Saab saying the legacy or the architecture as it's been driven by socioeconomic considerations. It's been driven only by whatever we had. I'm sorry, I have to say it. It is driven by inertia. There was a tariff structure in 95. There was a tariff structure in 98. There was a tariff structure in 2005, etc. I don't believe anybody has made any effort to think through, should we have this 7 slabs for residential, 2 or 3 or 4 slabs for industrial, 1 or 2 for commercial, etc. Should we be looking at? Nobody's given that any thought. Nobody's given any thought to the question of, should residential consumption be subsidized by charging industry and commercial sectors more than the cost of supply? If they have, then it's not available in the public domain. And therefore, that element of, we are talking of inertia and therefore not willing to change from the past, is what is guiding the tariff regime. One other additional element which I believe is guiding the tariff regime is this very strong emphasis on submit, defend, and I will approve. That's going to lead to its own challenges. It did lead to, for example, the challenge that you faced. You want some new curtains in? Why didn't you come to me for approval? That mentality of submit, defend, and then we will approve, maybe that's got to be reconsidered. Now, on to the question of this element of, we are moving or we may be moving towards a competitive market. Is there any disagreement in that? I don't believe anybody in this forum will disagree that we should be. We may not be moving fast enough, but we should be moving to competitiveness, be it at the generation level, be it maybe even at the consumer level. However, in order to move towards a competitive regime, the question arises, has NEPRA given any thought to what would be the kind of tariff rules or tariff procedure it would involve in setting competitive? And I'm not talking something that's out of thin air. I'm talking about, I think it's item 5 or 6 of the 13 or 14 standards, which are specified in NEPRA's tariff standards and procedure rules. There is one item which says will be governed by marginal cost pricing principles. The next one, NEPRA shall have a preference for competition and therefore will design what's being done in that regard.
Thank you.
If those things are not done, we will stay with the inertia. We will stay with the existing regime, tinker with it at the margin, raise this particular slab by 7%, that by 10%, this particular consumer category by 4%, that by 20%, etc. And our tariff structure will never move from that.
मैंने राशिद साहब एक चीज मैंने देखी है हमारे मुल्क में बहुत है. We hide behind the law and regulations because we don't want to change, because we don't want to think innovatively. Okay? Whatever it might be, the regulatory objective, as I said, from central banking, and what I know is very clear. And the central bank does not hesitate, like our central bank closed down Mehran Bank without a moment's hesitation. It closed down other banks too, very clearly. BCCI was closed down here very clearly. Okay? There are things that happen, and they happen when we know how to do our business. The fact is, on energy, we don't know how to do our business, and that's why all this mess is happening. And that's all I'm saying. Shaheen and Nisar Sahib, boliye.
Nadeem, I'm going to have to interject out here. You're saying we don't know how to do our business. My claim on that is, unfortunately, the exact opposite. We do our business as efficiently as we allow it to be, as much as we allow it resources for upgrade, improvement, etc. That is the level that we are achieving. If we do not allow for additional investments, we will go for that through that excess demand and excess supply. If we do not allow enough resources for upgrade and modernization and those loss reductions and everything, we will be
basically we should borrow from the World Bank to upgrade all the time without ever achieving upgradation.
No, yes, we should be ready to allocate those resources in the tariff, whether they come from borrowed funds or they come from reinvested earnings. That is perfectly sensible financing. I'm sorry, I'm going to...
Shahina Nisar.
Hello, Assalamu alaikum. This is my first attendance. I'm just listening to everybody, and I'm getting this.
Don't worry.
First time, but I worked in the energy sector for a long time, and I have worked on marginal cost pricing, and I've worked on pricing and energy efficiency and demand side management and other stuff. And I was just thinking that I really liked the presentation of Amina Sohail, who's the lawyer, and she did talk about the basic premise on which regulation should be done, and that would be to rationalize how the price structure takes place, right? So whether it's marginal cost pricing or something, one has to rationalize it. It's not just on the whims, which I am getting an impression that regulation is the key to driving the power sector in Pakistan, which should not be the case. Why should there be a safety welfare objective right at the beginning? One has to think about the efficiency of the sector. By the way, I would like to present, I wrote a chapter on fiscal policy and economic growth. This was edited by Cheryl Gray and Aristomani for ECA countries. And I looked at different aspects of the power sector in 7 countries in Eastern Europe. And I looked at the hidden subsidies also, and I related it with how the fiscal policy gets affected, or how fiscal space gets squeezed when the energy sector, when the power sector is not working properly. But that's a side issue. I think my suggestion would be to start paying attention to the commercialization aspect, to look at the energy sector as not something to be regulated, prices as not something to be regulated, but they should really look at the resource efficiencies and look at the resources, the new resources like renewable energy and wind power, solar and everything. And then we should have a role of energy efficient technologies in different sectors also. That would definitely be working in, and we're talking about basic economics, the market model, supply and demand, but energy sector in the power sector seems like too much driven by the supply aspects. So I think we need to have some role of technologies, and we need to rationalize the prices, and regulation should not be something which should be the priority. I think these are my general comments at this time.
Thank you, Shaina.
Thank you.
Iqbal Ultra, Iqbal Ultra. Iqbal Sab. Iqbal is gone. Okay. Then we'll go to Amina Sohail again. Amina wants to talk. Iqbal Sab, you have anything to say? I think Iqbal Sab is trying, but he can't seem to do it. He's not doing it. Iqbal Sab, we can't hear you, Iqbal Sab. We can't hear you. Iqbal Sab, we can't hear you. Ab boliye. Haan. Boliye. No, Iqbal Sab, we can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself, Iqbal Sab. अब फिर आप म्यूट कर देते हैं. Okay, छोड़ दें. Amina, baby, go ahead. Anybody else from the panel wants to speak?
सर अख्तर अली साहब से पूछें.
अख्तर अली साहब बोलिए. अख्तर साहब. जी अख्तर साहब. अख्तर साहब अनम्यूट.
जी मैंने किया अनम्यूट.
हाँ जी,
आवाज आ रही है
अब आ रही है.
साहब I would start on the independence of the regulator. I would start with the verse of Iqbal. He said, मुल्ला को जो मस्जिद में सजदे की इजाजत नादान समझता है कि इस्लाम है आजाद. Anyway, देखिए बात ये है कि अभी IPPs have been partly taken care of. Now the turn is for NEPRA. NEPRA's house has to be put in order. There is a need, heavy need for review of NEPRA performance and the reforms that have to go into it. The regulatory process is heavily influenced by the vendors. The determination meetings that are held are, in those meetings, consumer is hardly represented. At some times, I have seen in the meeting rooms 25, 30, 40 companies and myself alone trying to defend the consumer. So the regulatory process is heavily influenced and dominated by the vendor. It is a common knowledge in Pakistan that you need not to have your own equity to be able to invest in power sector. Zero equity syndrome is largely known. The IPP report that has been given, the IPPs have been defending themselves that it is NEPRA which has given this tariff to us. Why are you catching us for these high prices? So NEPRA is quite culpable in the situation that we are in. The average tariff NEPRA has been giving is from 40 to 100% high. NEPRA has capacity and capability problems. NEPRA has only financial experts. They do not have neither do have themselves have capability to assess costs, nor do they engage third-party experts. I have not, for the last 10 years, I have been attending the determination meetings, and I have been examining NEPRA literature, frequently attending the determination meetings. I haven't seen yet any third-party determination or any third-party input on multi-billion-dollar investments. What they do is they take either PPIB's advice or they take vendors' data and do plus minus to it and award the tariff. So time has come that the government appoints a third party to review the NEPRA processes, NEPRA performance, and NEPRA capabilities. There are many issues which I have been raising over the last 10 years. NEPRA arbitrarily awards capex, arbitrarily awards the debt margins of 4.5% and etc. So the time has come that somebody takes care of NEPRA. Thank you.
Thank you, Ji. Let me bring in Waqas Najib Saab, Member Planning Commission. Waqas Saab, would you like to say anything on this subject? You know the power sector very well. How should we, I want to ask you a very general question. This is not about REPNA. How should we develop a regulatory system for the power sector? I'm a bit at odds to understand that even after this webinar. What should the regulation be doing? What is its business? How can it regulate, Salman Saab is right, how can it regulate a government-owned business?
Thank you very much, Dr. Sam. As always, it's a very useful discussion. I think to understand the role of regulator in a discussion or a seminar like this, we may have to separate the issues. I think we are talking about 4 or 5 different layers of 4 or 5 different issues. So, for instance, first issue is setting the tariff for generation. So whether it's cost plus or other models, so regulator has been setting generation tariffs. The second issue that we discussed was how to design the schedule of tariff and cross subsidies based on cost of service study or any other cost of service method. So the second component is how to set end consumer prices by the regulator. I think the third issue is compliance of regulatory rules and laws, which has been one of the problem in KE and other issues, also IPPs, which Salman Saab also mentioned. And over in compliance side, there is role of the courts that have, in many instances, have been stepping in the regulatory regime. And I think the fourth and the larger pillar is overall design of the sector and evolving it to a certain direction from state-owned to a more corporatized and eventually privatized and competitive market. And I think we may have to evaluate the performance and the role of the regulator independently in each of these regimes or each of these functions that the regulator has been performing over the years. I think on one side, there may be a larger agreement that on the generation side or on cost or tariff of the generation, despite having almost 2 decades or over 2 decades of experience, the regulator has not performed as good as it should have, even in the cost plus tariff setting regime. And that we could see from even the upfront tariff setting on the coal and LNG and transmission side. So I think despite having all the experience, we were still found lacking in setting good cost plus tariffs, which in my view should not have happened in coal and other projects. And some of Akhtar Ali Saab's observations and everybody else's observations that, even in cost plus, I think we should have done better and we do not get good marks. On cost of service side, I think there have, in the design of schedule of tariff, multiple slabs, Rashid Aziz is probably right, there is inertia. So and I think around 8-9 years ago, there was an attempt to do cost of service study for each of the DISCO. And as a result, many steps should have happened and we should have a different schedule of tariff and different slab designs based on cost of service and cost of serving customers at each of the voltage and customer category. I don't know if it moved forward. I have not seen any drive to change the schedule of tariff and slab categories based on real cost of service. So I think on that side also, I think we can say in designing the consumer end tariff, the regulator should have done more job. I'm sorry, I feel bad for Salman, who's representing the regulator, but it's difficult for him. But I think it's more of a general discussion which should inform the future course. On the third aspect, which I discussed, which was the performance of the discourse. I think over there it's unfair. First we'll have to establish the principle that if the regulatory tariff and regulators' performance targets are the real drivers of distribution companies' performance. I think that is not correct. So, even if the regulator sets a benchmark loss of 10%, it's irrelevant as long as the companies are not corporatized, they are not financially independent. And I think since they have recourse to free equity from the government, I think this whole regulatory target setting I don't think it sets the right direction. It just makes the discourse in more losses. So I think the distribution companies' performance setting will have to go hand in hand with the governance reform in the distribution companies, so that there is some performance KPI setting which can go with the regulatory targets as well. I say on that front, I think a larger confluence of regulatory benchmark setting with the distribution governance reform, I think there will have to be a marriage between the two. Otherwise, I don't think it makes much of a difference from regulatory targets alone, if as a driver of distribution companies' performance. On the fourth aspect of the regulatory role, that's design of the overall market, I think Salman very politely mentioned in the middle that there was shortage of supply and supply-demand gap. So the regulator was probably forced to. So I think on that there hasn't been clear lead or any responsibility and ownership of who will drive the change in the market, even after NEPRA's constitution. So I think over past 2-3 decades, we probably set our initial direction towards a corporatized and efficient and privatized and competitive market, but it got stuck and there was no owner of getting us out of that inertia and out of that wherever we got frozen. So I think there's lack of ownership, both from the government and the regulator. So I think on all these fronts, we may have to look at regulatory performance differently, regulatory ownership differently. And we may have to, I probably agree a bit with Akhtar Ali Saab that, the regulatory role, the capacity will have to be reviewed and enhanced if it has to play its role in all of these 4 or 5 areas where we its performance.
Waqas, what role is the Planning Commission playing in all this? Shouldn't you be rethinking the role of the regulator in the market, etc.? Isn't that the job of the Planning Commission? Should we be doing that? Waqas, could you hear me?
Yes, but I couldn't unmute myself. Now I can. So I think the Planning Commission itself as an institution does not really have the capacity to go beyond appraisal of the PSGP projects as an institution. As a concept, I think it should be doing a lot more than it is currently doing. But I think in the larger context in the power sector, since there are many players, so one entity will have to play this coordinating role between all the players of the market. The regulatory function so far, as it has seen from the beginning of the regulatory constitution, it wanted to be more of a quasi-judicial forum. Initially, it tilted more towards a judicial-like forum where it's only adjudicating on the petitions. Lately, it has become more operational and less judicial in its outlook and the way it's carrying out its decisions. So I think that there needs to be more thinking. I don't know if Planning Commission as an institution has the capacity to lead it. But yeah, we will have to find one institution that
where is this thinking? Where is this thinking done? I mean, Rashid Aziz, for example, came along and said there's no shortage of research and ideas. So where is this thinking happening? Where is the research and ideas being developed in the country that led to the uniform tariff system, that led to the changes in NEPRA laws, that led to the making of the NEPRA laws? Who does all this business? I mean, I'm really interested. I want to find out where it happens because I can't seem to find it.
Would you like some view? There is definitely.
Rashid, you go ahead. I'll add later.
Waqas साहब को बात करने दो. You'll have your chance, Rashid साहब. You'll have your chance. बोलिए, हाँ जी. वक़ास साहब बताइए.
जी. So I think it's I partly agree with Rashid Saab on one aspect that I think on the issue of power, we'll have to probably separate the issues distinctly. So one of it is the engineering part of it, running of the power sector, the power plants. I think Pakistan has developed good capacity on the engineering front, and I think that capacity just needs to be developed. On the pricing issue, when you talk about the tariff and uniform tariff, that is more complex because it involves subsidy, it involves fiscal management or debt management. It also involves the socio-economic component or the political economy.
My question is slightly different. Every company, you've been in many companies, you know this better than me. Every company has a corporate strategy department. Every company has some kind of a department where thinking is done about its existence, about its future, about where it's going. Where does it happen in Pakistan as far as the energy system is concerned?
A block.
So I think formally it does not happen. Formally it does not happen. Formally it should happen at the Ministry of Water and Power. Ministry of Power or Power Division, Ministry of Energy. It should happen there, and it should have more of a policy and thinking role. However, it has become more involved, or for the past 2-3 decades, in operations of the DISCO. So essentially, Power Ministry runs the distribution companies as a holding company, which also has a management role directly. So I think that we have a problem there.
You got operations, capacity, financial management, all mixed in one.
Yes, and I think that's where the problem lies. So I would categorize it in not lack of capacity. So I think we've got human resource, we've got ideas, but I think the role of institutions that needs to be clarified, and probably the ministry will have to redefine its role. And it's something that is being discussed, and hopefully we'll see something towards this end in the coming.
Let me go back to Rashid. Rashid, you were saying something?
Yeah, I'd like to say something about exactly this topic of where thinking is done. As Waqas said, yes, a lot of it, or almost all of it, is coordinated. That's my distinction from his wording. It's coordinated at the Ministry of Water and Power, but it does involve inputs from everybody at 3 or 4 different stages. One, at the preparation stage, the group that is preparing, for example, a policy framework. That group does include representatives. And I'm going to give a specific example, even from NEPRA. I remember Iftikhar Saab was in, as far back as 2017, he's one of the lawyers who's worked in NEPRA or working in NEPRA. He was part of the group that was preparing the policy, and I saw it on his screen and I said, how did you get this? And he said, I'm part of that working group that is writing it. Planning Commission, I'm sure there is a representative in preparing. Finance Division, yes, there is. WAPDA, there is. I'm sure there is. They can pretend that they're never asked and somebody just imposes something on them. The reality is the second place where it comes into a multi-ministerial and across, at the preparation of the summaries, the summary for submission to a cabinet or to whatever forum. That summary goes through all those reviews and comments by other ministries, departments, and associated individuals. And the third, where it goes through, is at those discussions at all those forums. Okay. All those forums, it's like a CCI.
It's committees and forums that decide it. Okay, fair point. I accept that. Amina Bibi, आप बताइएगा, what is your view on all this? You also want to say?
Sir, just one thing
Yeah,
I'd like to add, sir.
Shahid, you can come in after me.
yeah.
Is
And this is also linked to the earlier comment that Waqar Sahab made that it's donor driven. I would just like to ask if anybody know, because I've just heard that in fact I can't really say it's for sure, but the person who was behind the 2018 amendments was not paid by the government, was paid by a donor agency. And why NEPRA now is claiming that we were not really considered while these amendments were being approved. I've also been part of a process of finalizing a law, that is the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, while I was working for the Ministry of IT and Telecom. That law is claimed to be the most debated law in this country. And it only relates to electronic systems, internet, and stuff like that. However, I think electricity is far more basic right. It should have been debated like anything. And I've seen for that particular law, i.e. the cybercrime law, people from various jurisdictions approaching the committees, the standing committees of the National Assembly and the Senate about one right or the other, religious groups of accommodating various contents relating to different other issues which relate to cybercrime law. So I wonder, I can agree, which Rashid Saab just explained as to this is the policy making process, but unfortunately, our lawmaking process is flawed. I've myself supervised for making from formulation to its actual notification of this one complete law that could not get passed for over 2.5 years. But because of this, some sort of synchronization that somehow got created, that law was passed. So for electricity law, it's such an important subject. I don't think that for 2018, that effort was put in place, and there are news of some more amendments coming in. So I think our lawmaking process should be made open. Those committees are of the National Assembly and the Senate are for discussion, but neither the committees are, because these are members of the National Assembly and the Senate. Senate, to a certain extent, you can say they are technocrats, but for National Assembly, people are from all over the country that are represented. So there should be an opportunity for the regulator to explain to those committees that this is what is meant under this law. This is the problem with this law. But I've been told that the chairman at that point in time was just simply snubbed by the head of the committee. So if this is the environment in which our laws are made, our policies are made, we can't really find something good out of that, unfortunately.
Ji, sir, I am sure glad that I've been waiting for 2 hours to hear that there's an amendment in Parliament which is coming through. That amendment in Parliament will override anything that NEPRA does and allow government to do whatever it wishes, whenever it wishes, wherever it wishes. So what we are debating is pointless, is completely irrelevant. If this new law comes into effect, which it will, given that the government has the majority, then I think we're back to square one. And
so where did this law come from? Who prepared this law? Where did it come from?
Apparently, so I'm told, that the law came from the Ministry of Finance, who wanted that all the cost or the additional cost that NEPRA doesn't allow into the tariff should be covered by the consumers. But it's a much wider and all-encompassing sort of an amendment, which sort of negates everything that has ever happened. I'd just stop at that.
Okay. Salman Saab, chaliye ji, let's try and get to some kind of a... Salman Saab, up to you now. Aap last words dein, then I'll go to Chima Saab, and then we'll try and close it, Chi. Salman Saab.
अच्छा इसमें थोड़ा सा, I mean, the topic is actually regulation and how NEPRA does its pricing regime. Somewhere, I think I'll probably need, Dr. Saab, your help, is that it may not be fair, at least, I mean, I've got the feeling that, I mean, topic is regulation and NEPRA, but the issues of power sector should not be squarely blamed on NEPRA itself, because there are other
There's no blame anywhere.
Yeah. There are institutions involved in policy making, and NEPRA essentially follows policy directives which come from the government from time to time. It's a part of our act as well. I mean, under the new act, actually, we are supposed to follow the policy and the electricity plan, which unfortunately have not been made public. In fact, there are still drafts going around, but it has not been approved. And without that, there's still amendment going on in NEPRA Act. That clarity is very important for us, that what is the electricity plan and what is the policy that will ultimately be approved by the CCI. That anything contained in that policy will be binding on us. So in terms of independence, it will be entirely driven by what the legislator or the decision makers want from NEPRA. Going forward, there's a lot of inertia. I mean, let me tell you very frankly, with regards to implementation of CTBCM. And in that, there are a few technology power plants which are not going to be there in future. For instance, thermal power plant, except for third, it's not going to be there. So the sector is evolving, and there's a lot of opportunity for growth, definitely, which not just at NEPRA, but at the government level, at every level, that needs to be improved. But we must appreciate that things are moving, and perhaps to a degree where we think that good will come out of it. For instance, the renewable energy is actually going to be a game changer in the sense that the tariffs are lower, is going to lower down overall tariff. The only issue which we are facing right now, it's not just NEPRA, but the power sector, is that unplanned expansion that happened. Because of that, we need more generation in order to flatten out the capacity curve. Till that time, in my personal opinion, till that time, we will not be able to see a lot of competitive market, a lot of wheeling, because at the end of the day, this is one of the concerns actually raised from the power purchaser, that if paying customer going out from the system through competition, not necessarily through competition, but through someone selling them a cheaper rate, then that remaining capacity is going to be divided by a lesser number of units. So that is, the people who are left in the national grid will pay more. So till that time, there is that issue. I don't know, and it will definitely be debated in NEPRA and at other forum, whether wheeling needs to be allowed, and CPP has concern with that. So till that capacity issues, which I'm sure after the government had made a number of MOUs with IPPs, which actually concerning more with IPPs that came into fruition under the policy of 94, 2006, and 2002. If that is applied in the government-owned power plants, almost 50% of the capacity are going to be from government-owned power plants. So if that is applied, the capacity, that we're talking about the flattening curve. So that's going to be happen. And after that, I think the market will be ripe for a competitive regime.
Sir, my immediate concern about what I hear from Salman is that in order to save the power sector, please sacrifice the country. Because if we are not able to compete internationally with our exports, with our industry, then we don't have an economic future. Sorry.
Yes, what I just want to let everyone know that just appreciate the fact that it's not that easy to make a decision to move towards competitive. I completely understand your point of view. But see, if it is allowed, and it's my personal opinion, if it is allowed that BPC and everybody can sell power to everybody right now at this very instance, you have a capacity payment of 750 billion. That is close to about 7.5 rupees. If that is shifted, if your demand is gone, then who's going to pay for it? I completely understand. I actually agree with you. This is not fair to the sector. But look at from the shoes from the decision maker. If we allow that, the people who cannot afford, the residential consumers, the industry will be completely gone because there's a lot of cheaper solutions available. So I just wanted to show that there's a both sides to it, and it's not black and white that we can make a decision right now. I just want everybody to appreciate that in these circumstances, it may not be very categorical to take one position or another. It's
no,
not like
agreed, totally agreed. There's no black and white in the world, of course.
Can I just add a
Let
comment?
me, Ji Amina Bibi, go ahead.
I agree with what Salman said, and also apologies, we're constantly picking on NEPRA. The fact of the matter is that the regulator was created probably at the behest of a foreign funding agency, but the regulator was never given the sort of power that it needs to exercise its role effectively. And that's given rise to all sorts of issues. In Pakistan, it's the Ministry of Energy and the Power Division that's effectively playing the role of the regulator. And other than tariff setting, NEPRA hasn't really had any proactive role or taken a proactive stance on any of the other roles that a regulator is typically given internationally. So having said that, Salman just mentioned that there are no simple solutions. And I agree with him, but then the situation in Pakistan requires an unusual, creative solution. And I'm wondering if NEPRA is giving any thought or doing any work on then coming up with an unusual, creative solution that will, like Shahid Saab said, save the economy and the business, preserve the businesses or the business community of this country while getting out of this issue of or addressing the issue of capacity payments. I agree with Shahid Saab. You cannot fulfill your capacity obligations at the expense of the business community or the economy of this country. And that's exactly what's going to happen if things stay the way they are, if our tariffs continue the trajectory that they're on currently. So is NEPRA doing anything to then come up with an alternative solution? We keep hearing of capacity payments. We have capacity obligations, but the solution is not shifting those obligations to the private sector or to the business community. Are there any alternatives that NEPRA is discussing currently?
Yes, there are.
Ji, Salman Saab, aap bolna cha rahe hain?
So, I mean, definitely, I mean, the conventional thinking will not work because that's a big problem, the capacity trap. And of course, I mean, why the capacity trap? Let's not go into it because then there are a number of issues because of that we are at this stage where there's a lot of capacity payment but less demand. The issue which we see is that as long as you have a sale growth, which is unfortunately not happening because of our constrained economic growth and also because of pandemic, how do you increase the sale? If you're able to increase the sale, then the impact of capacity prices are reduced. In fact, it's flattened, and the cost of idle capacity is lowered.
Salman, can I interject for 1 second? This issue was raised half an hour ago as well, that we're stuck in a capacity trap. But it seems a little oxymoronic because we're a country that per capita consumes half the electricity of our underdeveloped neighbors, like for instance, India. Our per capita electricity consumption is about half of India right now. The demand here is suppressed. It's not really low. It's suppressed by the excessively high electricity costs. Our electricity tariffs are competing with the United States of America, and we're a developing country. Basharat Chima Saab pointed out earlier on that we're following a load suppression model as far as our tariff setting mechanism is concerned. We have this ascending block rate structure, and there are alternatives to it. For instance, the descending block rate structure, where the more you consume, the less you pay for the electricity that you consume. Why aren't we looking into solutions like that? Has anybody done a study or an economic analysis of shifting to a descending block rate structure, for instance? How will that impact the capacity payments and the tariff?
Okay, so there are two things to it. Number one, I just want to complete my initial thought. So we're talking about innovative solution. We have recently extended the contract of Tapal and Gul Ahmad. It was 94 policy power plants. I mean, he trained for 22 years and we have given it a 3-year extension. In that decision, several other decisions, which we have said that there needs to be a holistic planning, which means NTDC cannot have its own planning and K Electric have its own planning. We need more number of units to be sold. In order to do that, we have under capacity in KE system and we have over capacity in NTDC system. So it's a no-brainer. If everybody has this information, I'm sure everybody will come at this conclusion that you need to have more power sold to K Electric system. And that's what we have said so many times, and it's not just us. We have actually written that all new power plants that are going to be commissioned by K Electric need to stop, at least put on hold. I mean, the right word would be put on hold, so that is able to sell you more. And in order to do that, you need to invest in infrastructure. So the argument that have been was that there is no infrastructure available. There's a 500 grid investment, 220 grid investment, so immediately cannot be happen. But what we have said that in terms of investment cost and in the time frame, you can build those line and grid station at much lower cost and much earlier than building the same plant. I mean, building an entire generating unit in order to support that. So we have given them 3 years that you can draw power from Tapal and go to Gulen. But meanwhile, before that, if something, if the grid is in a position, both sides, NTDC and K Electric is in a position to get more energy from the NTDC, so definitely that contract will expire. And in addition to that, there are other issues as well. For instance, the pricing of gas as well. So there are a lot of captive potential in the system, just like Armina said. The captive potential is there, but they have been supplied a very cheaper gas, and those gas power plants are inefficient. So the pricing needs to be appropriate in order for the bulk power consumer who have their own energy and own capacity through a source which is cheaper, needs to have a right pricing so that they have the incentive to shift towards the grid. So all these things we do, but at the end of the day, we recommend. We cannot even extend to those petrol, because it's an entirely different sector. It's a petroleum sector. I mean, we have from time to time during various meeting and corresponding have actually told the power division that this is where the potential lies. And those, I think, are definitely the participant will have their own thoughts about it. And there may be other solutions. But considering this constraint, it's very difficult. The decision making is very difficult. Either you allow a complete removal of sanction. I mean, I won't say, put the word sanction, but do you allow BPC to sell directly? Do you allow the distribution company to remove the exclusivity so that everybody can sell to those that exactly they'll get your most efficient consumers, which are industrial. Right now, they are paying about 22, 23 rupees per kilowatt hour, but any solar power plant can sell them at, I don't know, less than 5 or 6 rupees. But those 22, but it is 22 rupees per kilowatt hour because it is subsidizing the residential sector. If you want to increase the residential sector tariff, then the government needs to tell us. It's at the end of the day, the government decision.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Salman Sahab. Ji, Amina, you want to say something else, or should I just now get?
I just wanted to add, and Salman is probably aware of this, but it still is worrying, and I still want to say, just to make sure that this is something that NEPRA is aware of. You just spoke about the competitiveness of solar power compared to grid scale electricity. And based on the latest statistics from NTDC, I believe there's about 50 megawatts of net metered solar power on the grid at the moment. But do you know that in 2019, or maybe even the year before that, in 2018, Pakistan imported 1 gigawatt of solar panels, and the combined capacity of both net metered and grid scale power plants in that year was not more than about 400 megawatts. So the question arises, where is this excess, where are these excess solar panels going? And the most logical answer is these are off-grid installations. Now, nobody's keeping a track of how much off-grid solar electricity is being installed in Pakistan. And my assessment is that it is exponential. It's growing at an exponential rate. So this system is going to collapse whether you do something about the excessively high tariffs in this country or not. The system is going to implode eventually. So if you did something now, however you want to spur demand, whether it's by lowering tariffs, if you haven't done a study on the impact of lowering tariffs or by giving some type of bulk discount, but you need to do it right now because this system is going to implode on itself regardless.
Good point, Amina. Maybe let me go to Bisharat Chima Saab for trying to square the circle for us. Bisharat Chima, you're very good at that.
Shukriya ji.
Can you please try to educate us, please? Ji.
शुक्रिया जी. मैं थोड़ा सा अर्ज करना चाहूँगा वर्नैकुलर में वो डिसाइड करते हैं कि किसकी जेब काटनी है और इसके बाद वही साइट भी डिसाइड करते हैं कि कहाँ लोग आएंगे जिनकी जेब कटनी है और फिर आगे चलते हैं. लेकिन इस सिलसिले में पहले अर्ज कर दूं कि अभी कहा गया कि लॉ आ रहा है और वो शायद मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ फाइनेंस स्पॉन्सर्ड है जिसमें उन्होंने कहा कि जैसे हम कहेंगे वैसे होगा. देखें वो अकाउंटेंट है टू द गवर्नमेंट, उसका काम सिर्फ एक है कि जितना खर्चा आए उसकी पेमेंट जो है उस सेक्टर का सारिफ पे कर दे. तो आप उन्हें कुछ कह नहीं सकते, बड़ी जायज़ बात है. इसके बाद हम आ जाते हैं पावर डिवीजन पे, जो इस वक्त मैनेजर है सेक्टर का, वो अपना काम नहीं कर रहा, वो कोशिश कर ही नहीं रहा कि बिजली बिके, बल्कि वो इनहिबिट कर रहा है रेवेन्यू बेस्ड लोड शेडिंग से. इस वक्त भी 5000 मेगावाट जो है वो बंद किया जाता है. इसके बाद मजीद पाकिस्तान में जो है वो बिजली देने के लिए कोई प्रोग्राम नहीं है. बांग्लादेश ने अभी डिसाइड किया है 1 महीना पहले कि उसका ग्लोबल कवर यानी कि पूरे नेशन में कवर होगा ग्रिड का. हमारे यहाँ जो है वो 65% है. इसके बाद जो इश्यूज हैं डिस्कोस के जिसकी वजह से वो कलेक्शन नहीं कर पा रहे, जैसे मैंने पहले भी अर्ज किया, उस सिलसिले में पावर डिवीजन कुछ भी नहीं कर रही. बेहतर है कि सोया रहा जाए, बिजली बंद कर दी जाए और इसके बाद जो कुछ भी है वो पैसे क्लाइंट या कंप्लाइंट कस्टमर से ले लिए जाएं. इसके बाद रेगुलेटर आ जाता है. अब जरा गौर कीजिएगा कि फाइनेंस मिनिस्ट्री सिर्फ एक बात करती है कि कॉस्ट ऑफ सर्विस जो हमारी है, जितने भी पैसे लगे हैं वो पूरे के पूरे सेक्टर से आने चाहिए. इसके बाद जो पावर डिवीजन है वो इसके लिए कोशिश नहीं कर रहा. अब आ जाता है जी स्ट्रेट अवे रेगुलेटर. रेगुलेटर जो है उसने पैडेड अप कॉस्ट ऑफ सर्विस जो है वो अप्रूव कर दी हुई है. उसने एक्चुअल कॉस्ट ऑफ सर्विस की तरफ वो गया ही नहीं है. जब वो एक्चुअल कॉस्ट ऑफ सर्विस की तरह जाएगा, पैडिंग्स ओवर इनवॉइसिंग को ख़त्म करेगा, इनएफिशिएंसीज को बीच में से निकालेगा. जो आपने पहले भी फरमाया कि आप आ जाएं, आप प्रेजेंट करें, हमें ब्रीफ करें, हम अप्रूव कर देंगे, उस मंत्रा के तहत ये चल रहा है. तो चीज़ें नहीं चलेंगी, चीज़ें बिल्कुल नहीं चलेंगी. लेकिन घूम घुमा के समझ आती है कि जो रियल रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी है इट लाइज विद द रेगुलेटर. इसके बाद गवर्नमेंट जो मर्जी करे. इस वक्त तो पोजीशन ये है कि पैडेड अप ओवर इनवॉइस्ड कॉस्ट ऑफ सर्विस जो है वो इन्होंने अप्रूव कर दी है. वो मिनिस्ट्री उस सिलसिले में कोई काम नहीं कर रही. फाइनेंस कहती है कि सबसे ले लें, मुल्क बंद होने को है और कोई चीज़ भी नहीं चल रही. तो इसलिए पीपल विल हैव टू स्टार्ट वर्किंग, अदरवाइज ये सेक्टर तो बंद हो गई, लेकिन ये है कि मुल्क को नुकसान बहुत पहुंच सकता है. शुक्रिया.
Thank you very much, Ji. I think a very important enlightening discussion. Yes, of course, it went in every direction, and as always, discussions do. And yes, of course, I think we tend to talk in such a way that there appears to be blame on somebody or the other. But our effort here is not to put any blame on anybody. We are really trying to learn, and I think we need to do this much more. PAD is very happy. We began the webinar series now. Lots of people are doing it. I think, quite frankly, we need 100,000 webinars a day because we really need to understand what's happening to our country. Unfortunately, we blindly charge on making laws. Judges also blindly charge on giving decisions. Lawyers also blindly charge on to doing various things. Yet, I stand by it. Rashid Aziz disagrees, and I'm happy to disagree with him. that there's unfortunately no research in this country, no thinking. We do things blindly. We run after, chasing after things blindly. And that's why this mess. This mess, if I could help it, I would set up a high-powered committee, probably commission, as was set up as is set up in many countries. You've heard of these commissions all over the world. That should now investigate the power sector fully, take at least a year or two with public hearings, with open process, and try and understand this system, which is really, really posing an existential threat to the country. As Amina said, it could implode. Other people have said it's driving the cost of business up. Other people are saying it's driving the cost of consumers up. It's a mess in every which way you look at it. Circular debt is huge. I don't know whether we'll ever think about it or not, but I can only leave you on a hopeful note that someday we will. Thank you very much, folks. We shall inshallah take it up again. I thank everybody. I thank all my guests. I thank all my panelists. I thank everybody for bearing up with us. One person that I need to ask again, Amina Malik. Amina Malik, would you say anything? Because I asked you if you could do a quick sum up. Is it possible for you to do that? Is Amina Malik there?
Gee, I'm here.
PDP.
I mean, the issues that the regulator is supposed to address are sort of getting conflated in the discussion around pricing. That was my takeaway from the conversation that was happening here. The regulator has a responsibility to maintain the quality of supply and the safety of supply, and then also keep the pricing or the tariff at a level that's affordable for the average consumer. But there was almost no discussion about the quality of supply in Pakistan and the safety of supply, which are huge issues from a consumer's point of view. I mean, tariff is one issue, but the quality of supply in this country is so poor. Regardless of what neighborhood you live in, you will experience substandard delivery of electricity service. That's just a reality. And this is essentially the responsibility of the regulator, and these functions of quality and safety feed into pricing. The pricing is a function of the sort of quality you maintain on the system and how safe it is, because those require capital, those features require capital investment. But the bottom line is that NEPRA as the regulator has immense power. In the United States, there is 2 levels of regulation, at the federal level and at the provincial level. There are provincial regulators in every state, regardless of whether the state electricity market is regulated or deregulated. Now, we only have one regulator in this country of 200 million people. They're managing a huge electricity system, and they have immense power, or rather they should have immense power. And if for some reason they're not being given the power to exercise their role, they need to push back. The regulator needs to be more aggressive, more proactive, and take its role as the supreme entity in the power sector. I mean, for me, and I'm sure for many other professionals, the regulator is much more important than the power division, or should be. But in Pakistan, you see the converse when you assess their roles. I mean, NEPRA's profile as an entity is nowhere near the State Bank of Pakistan's. Although I would contend that the role that NEPRA plays is much more important, if not as important, as the State Bank of Pakistan, because electricity is such an essential commodity, both for our social lives as well as our economic lives. And having said that, more power to NEPRA. If NEPRA knows best what it needs to fulfill its obligations and its responsibilities, and I think they understand their obligations and their responsibilities, it's just a matter of asserting themselves as an institution.
Okay. Thank you very much, Amina Bibi. Thank you. I appreciate what you've said. And look, NEPRA, as far as I can see, is the people's body. Regulation always has to be separate from the government. Regulation must be a people's body. It doesn't belong to the government. It doesn't belong to any ministry. So it should be separate, just like policy. It's our policy. It should be separate. So with those words, thank you very much, folks. I won't say anything more. I think we've had a very good discussion. We'll return to the subject again at some point soon. All the best. My thanks to all of you. Khuda Hafiz.